Welcome to the case study course. My name's Kieran. I'm a senior tutor at ACA Masters. When I sat the case study exam myself, I won the ICAEW prize for the highest score in the world with a score of 92%. Several of my students have also won prizes for their performance in the case study exam. One student won the same prize as me, the ICAEW prize for the highest score in the world, this time with a score of 90%. This student had previously failed with other tuition providers, which demonstrates a level of improvement that can be made under our guidance. Another student won the ICAEW prize for the highest score in the Northeast region with a score of 88%. And several of our students have won prizes for achieving the highest mark in their firm. During the course, I'll be teaching you the exam techniques and strategies behind the success so that you too can achieve a similar level of success. 5 to 6 weeks before the exam, the advanced information will be released. This provides background information on the company, and it's generally in the same format every time. So whilst each case study business is different, it's a different company, it's got different products and services, different customers and suppliers, different issues facing the business, the advanced information is generally in the same format. So we usually get a few exhibits on the market background, explaining the nature of the industry, the businesses in the industry, perhaps something about customers, suppliers, industry growth, and issues affecting the industry. We'll then get an exhibit, or perhaps a couple of exhibits, on the company itself, the nature of its products and services, its types of products, customers, suppliers, revenue streams, costs, etc. We'll then be given the management account for the most recent years, and we'll be told about the key issues facing the business, strategic goals, risks facing the business, and some media articles which will give us some more information on issues facing the company and the industry more generally. So therefore, whilst each case study business is different, you'll see the advanced information is generally in the same format. So when you look at several case study exams, you'll appreciate this when you look at the advanced information. So what's really important with the advanced information is that we have the key facts and figures readily available to us in the exam. So the advanced information is released 5 to 6 weeks before the exam. So in these 5 to 6 weeks, we'd have spent a lot of time working through the advanced information. And during my AI analysis class, I would have been through each exhibit, identifying the key narrative points, the key numerical points, and most importantly, how these are likely to be useful in the exam. So prior to the exam, you'd have spent plenty of time with the AI, where we will have identified all the key issues facing the business and how each piece of information is likely to be useful in the exam. And therefore, when you come to exam day, you'll have all this information in a very readily available format, so you'll be able to quickly use it in the exam as and when you need to. It's important to appreciate, however, that there are lots of points in the AI which will be irrelevant to the exam requirements. So it tends to be that students spend a lot of time with the advanced information, quite naturally, because it was available to you 5 or 6 weeks before the exam, and you know your exam is going to be on this business. However, what's really important is that you don't try to kind of force points from the AI into your answer, and that right from the outset, you appreciate that there'll be a lot of information in the AI, which will be irrelevant to the exam requirements. So it could be in the exam that nothing comes up around production processes. So therefore you wouldn't bring this information into your answer, regardless of how many good points that you thought about in the 5 or 6 weeks building up to the exam and the great points you were going to mention about how they could reduce wastage. If the exam requirements are not looking for points on that, then you should not bring that in to your answer. Some students even go as far as getting industry reports on the specific industry that they are looking at. And therefore it tends to be that most students, not all, but most students overanalyze the AI. And it's really important that you appreciate from the start that you shouldn't try to force points from the AI into your answer. Instead, you need to make sure that you focus very carefully on what the examiners are asking for in the actual exam requirements, and you develop points using the exam paper information to answer that specific requirement. And what you must avoid doing is trying to answer a requirement you thought might come up or that you hoped might come up, so that you can bring in these really good points you thought about in the build up to your exam. So the key is to focus on exactly what the examiners are asking for and to use the exam paper information as much as possible in your answer. And therefore you only bring the AI points in when they are clearly relevant to the specific requirement that you are asked. The case study exam paper will have the same 3 requirements. So requirement 1 will require you to analyze the financial performance of the company. Requirement 2, evaluate a financial proposal. And requirement 3, evaluate an opportunity or issue. So again, even though each case study business is different, you'll see that the 3 requirements are broadly the same. You have to analyze the financial performance of a company. And of course, you've seen this in earlier exams, corporate reporting, SBM, and BST. So you should be quite well versed in those skills, particularly if you've used my courses for those subjects. Then requirement 2, we have a financial evaluation. And then requirement 3, in some ways similar to requirement 2, in that it's an evaluation of an opportunity or issue. And therefore, again, even though it differs between case studies, the 3 requirements are the same. So therefore you have advanced information whilst on a different business, generally in the same format. The exam paper has 3 requirements, again on a different business, but generally in the same format. And then the marking key itself is in the same format. So as with all the exams, we have the marking key, and therefore you can see how marks are awarded and what for. Again, a different business, so the points will be slightly different, but it's broadly in the same format every time. So while some students tend to think of case study as being a unique exam and every exam is completely different because the case study business is different, actually the format of the exam and the nature of the exam is quite consistent. And therefore you can develop an exam technique which will ensure that you ace every requirement. And as with the other ACA exams, lots of question practice so you can work on your exam technique will enable you to perform very well in this final ACA exam. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it 1 requirement at a time, and I'm going to explain and demonstrate exactly what you need to do for each requirement. So I'll firstly explain what the requirement involves, what information is provided in the exam paper, what information is provided in the AI. I'll then demonstrate exactly how you should structure and write your report by working through an exam paper in full. And this will enable me to demonstrate which points to include in your answer. And I will also show you how case study is marked so you can see how you will score marks in your exam. Now, in this class, I'll be working through a recent exam standard case study exam. So this is one of our mock exams from 2021. So I suggest prior to watching the class, you've familiarized yourself with the advanced information. Because as I've said, even though the exams are in the same format every time, and this is specific to that case study business. So it's highly advisable that you have read the advanced information document prior to watching this class and watching me work through the exam question to demonstrate the exam technique to use. So this is available to ICAEW students on the ICAEW website, so you can access the advanced information there. However, this class will still be useful even if you haven't read that information. However, to get the most out of the class, I really think that you should be familiar with DGS. In this class, we're going to look at requirement 1. Requirement 1 has 2 parts to it. The first part requires you to analyse the financial performance of the company. And what this involves, as was the case in the CR, SBM and BST exams, is it requires us to compare the performance, and remember when we're looking at performance, we're looking at revenue and profit, the P&L. So compare the performance of the current year to the prior year. We need to give reasons for the movement, so commercial reasons why revenue has gone up or profit margins have gone down, for example. We also need to identify trends, any significant movements, and provide further analysis of the numbers. And then we also need to consider the context of the performance. So the exam exhibits will provide us with the current year management accounts. We'll have some narrative so that we can identify the reasons behind the current year movements, and it will usually provide us with some context. So when you look at a requirement 1, as you can see here, we have to review the management accounts compared with the previous years. So the review should be based on the management accounts, which will be set out in the exhibit. It should cover revenue for each channel and in total cost of sales, and total gross profit. So you can see we're given clear direction on the areas to focus. So we'll be given the management accounts, as you can see here, and these will be in the same format as the advanced information, so we'll be very familiar with this come exam day. We just spent a lot of time using this in the mock exams in the build-up to the actual exam. Now you can see that we're told in your review, you should refer to the additional information provided in Exhibit 20. So it's almost always the case that there'll be some additional information provided here in narrative form. And what this does, it gives us the reasons as to why certain items have gone up or down. We'll be told about certain events in the year, such as they've won a new client or they've lost a new client or suppliers put their prices up. And therefore, this is going to give us the reasons as to why certain items have gone up or down. And again, quite similar to those earlier exams that you would have seen before, usually given some narrative when you have to analyze the performance of a business so you can explain why it's gone up or down. And then perhaps the trickier bit is identifying those trends. And then we're usually given some context points as well in the exam information. So maybe the industry has had a good year or a poor year and growth has gone up. So therefore you can see how the exam exhibits help you answer the question, because you've got the current year numbers, so you can do the analysis to see what's gone up and what's gone down, and you're given the reasons as to why certain things have gone up or down. Now, of course, the advanced information will need to be used here. So the advanced information would have provided us with the prior year accounts, and we'd have done a lot of analysis on this in the build up to the exam. So in the build up to the exam, knowing that requirement 1 is going to require us to analyze the performance, we could have looked at the previous year performance compared to the year before that. So we could have looked at the various revenue streams. We could see, have they gone up or down, and what were the reasons for this in that previous year. Now, of course, these are almost like dated reasons, if you like. This is why revenue went up or down in a previous year. So these aren't going to be, or they might not be useful when we're analysing the current year on exam day, but it is useful to understand what caused them to go up or down in the past, maybe because it's the same reason which is affecting the current year. And also it enables us to get a good understanding of the business, what factors impact performance, and also we might start to identify some trends, because if it's the second year in a row that this has had an impact on vets revenue, for example. And it also gets us into that mindset of thinking, okay, this number's changed, what's the reason, and what trend or further analysis can we identify here? So the advanced information is particularly useful because it's kind of got us into that mindset of thinking, what's the reason that this item goes up or down? What's the reason this item goes up or down? So therefore, when we get to the actual exam day and we've got the exam paper, we're already kind of familiar with, okay, so this will have an impact on that revenue stream and this will impact that revenue stream. So it's helped us build up a really good understanding of the management accounts and the business as a whole. Now, of course, when we do our analysis and we compare it to the previous year, we obviously need these numbers. So therefore, it's really important that you have these numbers to hand in an easy to use format. And you could already have begun to thought about how you're going to lay your appendix out. So we've kind of thought, when we've worked with the AI numbers, how we would lay out our appendix 1 if we have to analyze the performance of the business, which is what we have to do in requirement 1. So then we've already thought through about how we might lay our appendix out. And as you would have practiced several mock exams in the build up to the exam, you would have got very quick at laying this out. Now, of course, you may need to flex it slightly because we're not sure exactly what information will be given in the exam. So in this question, for example, we had some additional numerical information like the number of clients. So therefore, we were able to undertake this piece of analysis. So therefore, this format would have worked very well indeed, but perhaps it could have been the case that we weren't given a number of clients and therefore you couldn't do this analysis. So therefore you might not have that in your appendix. So you would have to kind of react to it on the exam day, but you would have been able to kind of build up a good idea and a good approach in the mock exams as how you're going to tackle this requirement. And the AI may have given us some performance targets, and it also provided us with some other context as well. So you might get your context points from here or possibly from here. So the important thing to do with requirement 1 is to firstly focus very carefully on what you've been asked for. So you can see here, revenue for each channel in total. So each channel and in total, cost of sales and gross profit. Now this is very important, and it might sound basic when I say read the question, but it's, as I explained earlier, there are many students who spend so much time with the AI and speculating on what might come up in the exam, and that's perfectly natural. Of course, you're going to do that, but you can kind of spend so much time doing that that you can almost kind of train yourself into thinking, oh, it'll be revenue, gross profit, and operating profit, for example. And therefore, students might include an analysis of operating profit, even though that's not in the requirement. So it's really important that you focus very carefully on exactly what you've been asked to do. Maybe those students thought of some really good reasons as to why, operating profit, might go down. You could identify the trend that, is declining rapidly, and you've been thinking about that point, and you're definitely going to make, a really good point here, and you're going to say it's, unsustainable if they're now, making a loss. But if that is not what you are asked in the exam, and you're only asked to analyze revenue and gross profit, then there won't be marks available. There won't be boxes on the marking key for this. So again, that's another good example of what I mean when I say, don't kind of force AI points into your answer. Looking at, admin costs as a percentage of revenue isn't going to be relevant in this question when you're only required to look at cost of sales, gross profit, and revenue. So therefore, it's really important, perhaps even more so. I mean, it's important in all the ACA exams, but perhaps even more so in this exam, because there's even more of a risk that you go down the route of kind of answering a question that you hoped or thought would come up because you had the advanced information. So read this very, very carefully, because you should use this as a heading for your answer in your report, and you should make points based on this. So therefore, having read that, you think, okay, we're analysing revenue, cost of sales, and gross profit. Therefore, I know what I'm going to have kind of as my appendix, and I know kind of the types of points that I'm going to include in my answer. Now, you'll see there's this second bit here to the requirement. We'll look at that, as I said. Now, we can think of requirement 1 as almost being in 2 parts. So we'll come back to that second part after. So we'll have the management accounts for the most recent year. And therefore you could start to set out your appendix, because we know that we're going to have to analyze the numbers as part of the questions. So we're going to have to identify, what's gone up, what's gone down, and then use these as the reasons why certain things have gone up or down. Therefore, you could start with your appendix, and we would have thought in advance, how best to lay this out. Now, this company had 4 different revenue streams, 4 different channels to market, and therefore we could lay it out on that basis. Because if you're looking at revenue overall, then we're going to want to analyze it by channel. They had different channels. We're told a lot of information about these different channels in the AI. Absolutely essential that we analyze it by channel, even if the requirement only said, looking at overall revenue, you'd still break it down by channel. The fact it's emphasized that you need to do it by channel, makes it absolutely imperative that you need to do it by channel. But we would do it by channel anyway. We always want to try and break revenue down into its different subsets, different streams, different divisions, perhaps different products, however the management accounts were set out, however the business reports its various elements of revenue. So again, prior to the exam, we would have thought about how we might lay this out. So we kind of said here, by a channel. So for each channel, we're going to say, has the number gone up or down? Then we're going to give a reason, and then we're going to think about some further analysis, and then we're going to have a context point. So we kind of want to do that for each channel. So therefore, we can start by having the numbers laid out in our appendix. We can analyze the numbers first of all. So of course, having worked through the advanced information in my AI analysis class, and having been through, the mock exams where you've practiced them, and then I've kind of debriefed them, we've spent a lot of time in this, in the build up to the exam, thinking about what requirement 1 might involve, and you'd have spent a lot of time practicing with these numbers. So you'll be really quick at kind of working through this. So you can have the 2021, 2020, then we'd have the absolute change and the percentage change. And we've already thought about, how we're going to lay this out in advance. And as you would expect, and as students are expecting for this exam, then we've got the revenue here by channel. So you've got the 2020 numbers, so you could copy those over into the spreadsheet area and then take the 2020 numbers over from the AI document, so they won't be provided again in the exam paper, but we'd have these here. So you could then copy those numbers over for 2020. And therefore we could start to have a look at what the percentage change was for each revenue stream. And therefore we can start to get an idea of which channel has performed well and which channel has performed poorly. And of course, this will be really interesting to see on your exam day because you spent so much time, doing the mock exams and practicing. It would be quite interesting to actually see, what were the numbers for this business. You spent so much time wondering, will this go up, and what reason might it be that vets has gone up or vets has gone down. So therefore it's quite nice when you actually get to exam day and you can see, what did actually happen then in the most recent year, because you spent so much time kind of wondering, what will happen, what scenario will the exam actually be in. So we can see here that we've kind of got, vets going down, others gone down, Taylors has shot up again. And of course, you probably expected this with Taylors, that's been doing really well, that key client there, other hasn't been doing well, neither's vets. So therefore you can kind of see here, actually, this might be as to what you perhaps would have expected, maybe in some ways a bit of a plain vanilla and as expected performance for the year. So of course we knew that it was really important to look at the underlying business, so excluding Taylors, so we could see how the underlying business has performed. So of course we did this in all of the mock exams, so therefore students were very well prepared for this. So we can see here that we'd have what it would be, not including Taylors, and therefore we can see that the underlying business has declined. So this is kind of almost masking the performance, and we spent a lot of time talking about this in the AI analysis class, and we thought about how we were going to bring this in to our answer and where we might include that. Now, we had wondered whether we'd be given, clients in the exam. So you may have decided to do the revenue mix now. Of course, we knew doing revenue mix was really important. So you might have jumped onto mix first because it's quite easy to do when the numbers are here. You just kind of bring that there and copy that down, or you could just copy these down. So then we could look at the mix by channel. So just make sure you kind of get your formulas set up here, because we're going to have vets divided by the total to see what percentage of revenue it is. So provided you just lock those cells for the total, and you'll be able to drag this down. Good sense check with mix is always to make sure that it equals 100%. Otherwise, you've kind of got something wrong there. Might want to sense check a couple of formulas to see what's going on there. Of course, if we pull this along now, we've locked one of those cells, so we just need to change that to D, but then you've got it for the prior year. Alternatively, you could copy the numbers over because you'd have them from the AI. Of course, might just be worth sense checking it, because then you can see that your formula's correct. Don't want to make a silly mistake on exam day. And you can see how much each has moved by. And then maybe just sense check it, because you can see here that Taylors now accounts for, actually equals 0 as well. So you can see that Taylors now accounts for greater share of revenue, which makes sense because Taylors has gone up. So of course it's now going to account for a larger share of revenue, whereas others gone down. So that would account for less revenue. So that all kind of makes sense. I always like to just do a logical kind of sense check whenever I do something, and that should help me identify whether I've got, made a silly mistake in the formula or something like that, or something hasn't dragged across properly. So of course, the number of clients, in the build up to the exam, we talked a lot about this. If you get the number of clients, then you can calculate revenue per client, and can do the revenue bridge, which was very specific to this company. So we were given the number of clients, as we'd hoped. We thought that would kind of come in here. So it's kind of good to see that in there, kind of as we had expected. So therefore we can think, okay, well now I can look at number of clients as well and get down to that average revenue per client. And we'd said, in the AI and in the build up to the exam that hopefully we'll get this, because we can think of some really good analysis that we can kind of do here. We can look at average revenue per client. We can look at the revenue bridge, and that's going to help us with those kind of further insight points. It might even be the reasons as well as to why certain things have gone up or down, but average revenue per client as well. So again, we've kind of got the prior numbers here. You may have wanted to have kind of refreshed yourself on, what they were, and maybe even how he calculated average revenue per client. But I think that's pretty standard there. So we had the number of clients, so 448, 125, and 108. So therefore we could put those in as we went through. And then of course that enabled us to calculate the average revenue per client. Obviously Taylors is just one client, so we didn't have that there. And then we've got the average revenue per client, so we can kind of work those out. Again, you could use a formula here, and I guess if you get your formula right here for average revenue per client and you drag that down, then you should be able to just kind of bring that across when we put the client numbers in here. So this would have been a good way to do it, because you think, okay, well, if I kind of get this right, then all I need to do is put the client numbers in here. And then if I drag that across, that will kind of get me to the average revenue per client in the current year. And really, we're just breaking this down, as we said in the AI class, volume, number of clients, and, price, revenue per client. You think of it like that, breaking it out between volume and price. Of course, as we discussed in those earlier classes, when I've analysed performances of businesses in BST, CR, and SBM, I've said always try to analyse, revenue. Is it due to volume, or is it instead due to price increase, or is it due to both? So we can see here we've got the number of clients. We can start to populate those. So we had 433. So 433, 158, and 107. Might want to just sense check the total just to be super sure, because it's exam day and we don't want to make a silly mistake in our appendix and give up a mark. We've got that there. And then you could kind of sense check these, and you can see these all seem to be calculating correctly. I mean, do they look reasonable based on the previous year? I mean, others are a lot lower, but then you can see the clients have stayed the same. The revenue has fallen by 43%. So therefore, if you kind of look at the percentage change on these, then you'd expect it to be similar, because the number of clients have stayed the same, and therefore there it is. So again, you can just see that little bit of sense checking that you can do. I always suggest kind of doing this with your numbers, just to make sure that should help you identify a small mistake you may have made. It gives you an unreasonable answer, so do that kind of almost like self-appraisal of your work. So we can see that there, and we can do it in total as well. So we can look at, in total, what the average revenue per client would be. So we'd have our total here, and then we can see what that would be in total in terms of average revenue per client. So if we look here, we've got, so that's taken Taylors. So therefore you can kind of see why that, what I mean there, why you have to just double check things. But we've got the total. So you could have kind of left Taylors there, but Taylors average revenue per client is obviously there's one client. So it's, one. So it didn't really make sense to have that. We identified that in the AI. So we can then start to look at our average revenues, actually exclude Taylors. So we've got our revenue excluding Taylors divided by number of clients, that's 16.64. And if we just sense check that back to what we knew in the AI, and that was a key number. So we kind of knew, when you're really familiar with the AI, we knew that was 18.25. So that makes sense. You can see just these ways you can kind of cross-check things, cross-check these numbers back to what you'd calculated in the AI, and then just make sure these all make sense, that you're using the same method for calculating things, check the numbers back to the exam paper. So then what was very specific to this business was looking at the revenue bridge. So we could look at how the prior year revenue reconciled to the current year revenue. And therefore, what we're really doing is that analysis of what's due to volume and what's due to profit, what's due to volume and what's due to a price change. So is it because you've got more clients? Is that what impact has that had on revenue? Or is it because the average revenue per client has changed? So, the amount you're earning per client, almost like price revenue per client. So therefore we could do the revenue bridge. And of course, having this to hand, would help you in the exam, because it just kind of reminds you how to do things. But going into this exam, students were really well prepared for this. All of the mock exams, included this in it. So students would have found this, fairly straightforward. We've drilled this calculation before the exam. So we'd be able to just kind of fly through the numbers really, but you just need to get it all kind of laid out nicely, because this is obviously going to be copied over into Appendix 1. So then you've got the average revenue per client for a current year, and then compared with the prior year. And then we just flex that for the number of clients in the current year, so we can see how much it's changed kind of by per client, and then flex that by the number of clients in the current year. But as I said, this was very specific to this case study. So then we'd be able to see the impact that change in average revenue has had. So we'd have the change in average revenue. And then we'd have overall, the change in revenue. And there was a little control check that we could do just to make sure that all kind of made sense at the end. So again, just thinking about these little checks and balances that you can have in place to make sure that your numbers are correct and you haven't made a small mistake somewhere. So what we need is to get the change in the number of clients. We need to pick up the change in the number of clients. We've got total here, so we've got current year clients, prior year clients. So the number of clients had changed by 17. So you've got the number of clients which had changed by 17, and then we needed the average revenue per client from the prior year, which we had was 18.25. And as we said, we had that kind of well rehearsed in advance of the exam. So then we just needed the average revenue per client. So this first number is showing us how many new clients there were in the year, and the average revenue per client from the prior year tells us what impact increasing the number of clients has had on revenue. So we could work that bit out. Then we could look at how much is average revenue per client change. So that's kind of looking at the volume part, and this is almost looking at like the price part. So how much revenue have they been getting from each client? So we've got average revenue per client in the current year, which we had here, which was a 16.64. We've got what it was in the prior year, and therefore you can see that it's decreased. So therefore that would have had a negative impact. And if we multiply that by the number of clients in the current year, so we had the number of clients in the current year, then we can see what overall impact this has had on revenue. And then overall, you can see the impact. So getting more clients has obviously increased revenue, but actually there's been a significant fall in average revenue per client, and therefore overall it's had a negative impact on revenue of 815. And of course we can see that here. Of course we're excluding Taylors here. Remember, Taylors was excluded from these numbers. And if we can sense check that, and yes, that makes sense. Could even sense check some of these other numbers. So yes, it went up by 17, the number of clients. So yes, that's right. But you can see number of clients only went up by 2.5%, whereas average revenue per client fell by 8.8%. So that's kind of more than offsetting the benefit from the increase in the number of clients. So of course, you'll be familiar with some of the technical aspects of this, from variance analysis, MI, which of course is examined at SBM as well. But this was covered and flagged heavily in the advanced information with the revenue bridge. So anyone familiar with the AI would have been very comfortable with working through that. And as I said, we covered it in great detail in the AI class prior to the exam, and also in all of the mock exams. So therefore, we've done our analysis there on revenue. So we've got the numbers. Now, of course, we know what we need to do isn't just, the numbers here. Yes, this will be, our appendix 1 in our answer for revenue. But what we need to do is we need to say, has revenue kind of gone up or down, by each channel, but we need to get reasons of why it's gone up or down. So I quite like to have a look, kind of a high level look, and think, well, others really gone down, Taylors has shot up, and vets is down. I think that's again, as pet stores are up. So you can kind of already know what impact that's going to have on the mix. But then importantly, looking at this revenue bridge, we can see the big picture really here is that number of clients are up, but average revenue per client's down, and overall that's had a negative impact on revenue. And that's revenue excluding Taylors. We excluded this kind of one-off client that's got its own channel here, this supermarket. So that was kind of the big picture. And I think, the build up to this exam, certainly I was, and I know students would have been quite interested to see, what actually happened, because we spend so much time with mock exams. Some mock exams, it's a good year. Some mock exams, it's a bad year. Other mock exams, it's, an average year, or maybe there's some positives and some negatives, perhaps like it is here. So it's actually quite nice when you get to the actual exam, what's actually going to happen. We've looked at the AI, we've looked at what's happened in previous years. So we've speculated quite a lot about what might happen, but of course it could go either way. So you don't really know until you get to the actual exam. So then we can think about, okay, well, we've got the numbers, we know what's happened, but we know in our answer what we need to do. It isn't just state the numbers. What we need to do for each channel is to say, has it gone up or down, of course, with the number, and give some opinion. Is it impressive? Is it disappointing? Is it significant? Is it insignificant? Is it dramatic? Is it modest? So trying to give some sort of opinion, on that change. But then we need to give a reason for it. We want to try and get this reason from the exam scenario. So like I said, in the AI, we thought, what happened in the previous year and what caused it to go up or down? And that's quite useful for the previous year, but that's not why it would have gone up or down, or not necessarily why it would have gone up or down in the current year. But we're given the reasons why certain items will have gone up or down in the current year. So it's so important that we use this information, use this exam paper information as much as we can. So like I said with the AI, only bring it in if it's clearly relevant. But with the exam paper, almost like the opposite is true. Try to use it as much as possible. I said with the AI, don't try to force points from the AI into your answer. I wouldn't go quite as far as saying try to force the exam paper information into your answer, but really try to use it as much as you can, even if it only seems, or even if it's not clearly 100% relevant. If you can generate a point out of it which helps you answer the requirement, then bring it in. So really try to use this as much as you can. Whereas the AI, it's the opposite. Only bring it in if it's clearly relevant. And that's the theme throughout this case study course. So make sure that you do that. So we're looking for reasons as to why each of these revenue streams has gone up or down. And of course, we need to have some context points as well. And we need these further analysis points. These are the tricky bits. Students always find these difficult. So obviously, number up or down with a reason it's gone up or down is quite easy. And, maybe a context point, related to that stream, either from the AI or for the exam paper is quite easy. The further analysis bit is quite difficult. But as I said, it's usually looking at things like, has the average discount changed, or what impact has number of clients had versus, change in revenue per client? Because of course we've worked that out for each channel. So we can see, did vets go down because clients, went down, or because average revenue per client went down? Well, actually both in that case. So in that case, it was due to both. So, you could kind of see, a trend there that not only is average revenue per client decreasing, but the number of clients are decreasing as well. So you can see it's kind of bad from both points of view. So that would be an example of what I said there, further analysis. So the obvious analysis to do is the numbers gone up or down? But you can see here that what we're doing is really providing this further analysis of the numbers by breaking it down into those two separate elements, or we identify a particularly significant movement or even a trend. So we could say, for example, vets has gone down, again, this is the second year in a row it's gone down, or third year in a row, or the decline is accelerating. So the rate of decline, not only is it the second year in a row it's gone down, but the rate of decline is accelerating. Maybe last year it was, we can actually be specific here. Last year it was 24.8%. If this year, if it was, more than that, so it's only 17%. So maybe you could say the rate of decline is slowing, but imagine if it was like 35%, you could say the rate of decline is accelerating. So not only is it declining, but the rate of decline is accelerating as well. So you can kind of see what I mean there by kind of a trend point. You can see what I mean when I say further analysis of the numbers. So looking at it kind of per client, revenue per client, looking at number of clients, the combination of the two. Is there a significant movement? Maybe they lost a particular client which accounted for 10% of revenue, something like that. Definitely the harder bits, but not too hard. And when you're familiar with the business, and as we had identified prior to the exam, these were some relevant points you could look at here. So you wouldn't need to make all of them. So you could just have one or two perhaps. And that's what we'd kind of flagged there in our pro forma report. We said, you don't have to have them all. If you're struggling with time, don't make sure you don't spend too much time here, because we need to attempt everything. We need to attempt every part of the requirement. But here were just some ideas of the types of points that students could have included. So when we're reading through this information, that's what we're kind of looking for. We're trying to keep that in our mind. Keep in your mind, what you need to produce. You need number, reason, further insight, context. As we kind of read through this, we can start to think about how something might be used in the exam. So you can see this is a couple of days before the exam date. Additional information relating to the draft management accounts for the year just ended. I've set out below some information that should assist in the analysis of revenue and gross profit. The following issues are reflected in the management accounts. So we're told in April 21, so we're told partway through the year, VST, now we knew about them from the AI. We knew that VST were a client for vets. They signed an exclusivity deal with one of our key rivals. So we knew this is where Hugh Logan had come from, and one of our current sales managers, but this was a key competitor here. So they signed an exclusivity deal with one of our rivals, and they ceased selling all DGS products. In addition, several other vet clients were acquired by larger practices throughout the year and were no longer permitted to stock DGS products. So we can see they've lost a key client, and other vet clients were acquired by larger practices. So clearly we've got a reason here why vets has gone down. You can see vets has gone down. We're looking for a reason from the exam paper. This is it. So fairly straightforward there. So there's different ways you could do this. You may decide that you want to have kind of a little plan perhaps. So we know that if we're looking at revenue overall, we're going to have it by each stream. So you could kind of have a little plan here. We're going to have revenue by each stream, and we're going to have overall revenue. We'll come back to that after, because it's a slightly different approach we take when analysing overall revenue. But for each channel, what we're going to want, you're going to have the number, of course, but then you want the reason, then we kind of want a trend point, and then we want a context point. So you could kind of lay it out like this and type the points in, as you go, if you like to have a little plan like that. Or what you can do, and I think what a lot of students did in the exam, was to use the pro forma report, which was provided as part of our materials pack, and populate it on here. So like with vets, for example, if you've got this as a hard copy in the exam by your side, a useful companion in the exam, then you could just type this in here. So that was due to VST, other acquisitions or something like that. Just maybe have a quick note there. So therefore you've got your kind of reason here as to why that was. And then we could think, what would we have as our further insight point? So alternatively, you could just type that in there, but maybe quicker to do this. Then your further insight point, why are you going to use one of these? Now, I don't think we were told anything about the discount. Maybe we will be after, so maybe we'll kind of add this on after. We could comment on the trend maybe because it's declined again. Now, the rate of decline isn't actually increasing because it hasn't gone down as much as in the previous year, but it's still declining. So we could say this revenue channel continues to decline perhaps. We could look at, is it due to the number of clients or is it due to the average revenue per client? So we could perhaps look at those numbers because we can see, I think that's one we already looked at, we can see that it was due to both. So we can see there's a decrease in both. So as I kind of said, negative looking at number of clients and average revenue per client. So we can have maybe these as a couple of points. Maybe that will do. We're not told, well, we were told about a specific customer, but we weren't given the numbers. It's not as though we were told this resulted in a reduction of revenue of, let's say, for example, it resulted in a reduction of revenue of 750K. Because then you could say, oh, well, actually, if you exclude that, then revenue had actually gone up. So that would be like an interesting bit of further analysis to do. But we didn't have that. We didn't have those numbers for that specific customer. And we can't really say whether that was a significant movement or not. You could possibly mention, the future impact. You could possibly say that, in the future, the decline should slow because this is kind of a one-off event which has caused that decline, perhaps. So you can kind of see what types of points you'd have here for those further insight points. And then this was, a good context point. This was from the AI. So this is quite relevant to vets, that the price-based competition has caused an increase due to concentration of clients. We could perhaps have that as well as our point. So you can kind of see here, we've thought of, number, reason, further insight point, context, and then we'd have that, for vets. We just keep reading kind of through this. We can kind of put these on our plans as we go through, but maybe keep reading through it because we're told some more information here. So maybe we will flex it slightly. So to ensure that the loss of VST and other clients was compensated for, Louis Bailey extended the parameters for the level of discount that could be offered by the sales and business development team. So we told a lot about discounts in the AI. Now we haven't really got any numbers here, but we do know that the level of discount has been extended, the parameters for that. So presumably there's been more discounting. So you'd already thought in the AI, well, what impact would that have? Well, actually, that could kind of boost revenue if you sell your products for less, but then volume goes up. But we know certainly it would have a negative impact on profit margin. So therefore, we could have thought here, about profit margin, and we'd already identified in the AI that discounts had gone up. So that's definitely going to impact there. It might have had impact on revenue as well. We're not really told much about what the level of discount was, though. We kind of knew what those discounts were from the AI for each channel, but we kind of need some numbers to work with, really. So in the next point, we're told sales and business development team recruited a significant amount of new pet store clients. So we know that there's new pet store clients. So is that kind of consistent with like the numbers we're told, clients, pet stores? Wow, they really had shot up. So yeah, that is true. So therefore we can see we've got a reason for pet stores, because we know with pet stores, revenue's up, number of clients up, but average revenue per client down. So that's a bit of a mixed bag there, but overall revenue is up, which is good. So when we do pet stores increased impressively, number, reason. So you could put here, well, your kind of reason is the number of clients. So that could kind of like become our reason. But we'd say, however, average revenue's gone down per client. So that'd be kind of interesting to look at there. Again, we could possibly look at the trend. Maybe we'll kind of look at that when we get to it. 22.7% in the previous year. So you can see, rate of growth not as high as it was in the previous period. And then we were told, so we're told that the RRP value of sales to pet stores was this. So we can now work out the discount because we know the RRP of the sales and we know what revenue was actually achieved. So therefore we'd be able to work that out. And again, that was something that was flagged in the AI. So they told us in the AI how we could calculate that discount. So if we think about the discount for pets, we've got the RRP, and we were told what that was. So 10.6 million. Now we know what the actual revenue was, so therefore we can work out what the discount was. Certainly looks quite substantial there. So you can see how much the discount was there on the sales. And we can see it's a 34% discount. So therefore we can actually, now we've been able to calculate that. So that's a good example of working with the numbers a bit more. We could now see that that would be a reason. So that could be our reason here for pet stores. So the reason here could be the discount. So we could just put here, discount, and we've already worked that out, 34%, because we knew from the AI, and you probably knew this off by heart kind of going into the exam, but we knew for pet stores it had been 30%, and therefore you could kind of say the discount's been increasing as well. So we're told, so again, you can see how I'm using this in my answer as much as possible. So proportion of Taylor's revenue generated through its website continued to rise as pet owners and consumers in general increased online purchases. So, Taylor's revenue more increased purchases. So that's going to be our reason there when we look at Taylor's. So again, you might kind of jot this down here. So we're told about Taylor's, and you could just kind of scribble on here that you've got, online, maybe even something as brief as that. You obviously want to plan because there's kind of quite a lot to do for each channel, but you want to do it as quickly as possible because we want to get through the exam as quickly as possible. The more points we can get down, the more marks we can score, the higher mark we can get. That's really important if you want to get to those top marks. So we told about New Dog Fit, this particular product that we were told about in the AI. So it continued to grow with revenue of this on a sales volume of this during the year. There's a soft launch of the kibble range. Now, this kind of affected overall revenue because it affected all the different channels, but we'd already thought about this. What happens if they give us some information on New Dog Fit in the exam paper? And we kind of thought about how this could be useful here. That probably fits in best with overall revenue. So we're definitely going to want to include the analysis of New Dog Fit. You may even decide kind of right now, I might do that analysis when I kind of do this part, but I definitely want to be including that, in my answer. Or you could start to look at some of the numbers, now we've got them, and we could think about, what we would have there for New Dog Fit. But because we already knew from the AI, what the expectations were for the year, and therefore we could see whether they would be higher or not. So we could use that in our answer. So we had the predicted revenue for New Dog Fit. So we were told here, so we could have a section here. You could have it kind of below, maybe this further analysis. You could have it kind of below here, or we could have it, to the side. But we knew here that we had with New Dog Fit, so we knew what was predicted, and we now know what the actual was. You could have looked at the prior year, but I think looking at that prediction was much more meaningful. So we knew that they had expected to sell 137 tons. We knew that the expected revenue was, so we've got the volume, the amount that they had expected to sell. We knew what the total revenue was as well. So we had the total revenue that they'd expected was 570K. And therefore we kind of knew what the average was per kilogram. So we've now got the actual numbers, so we can kind of see how that kind of turned out for New Dog Fit. So we can see that the average revenue is above expectations. Well, we were told what the volume was as well, on a volume of 150,000 tons. So maybe it ended up that it was more successful than they thought. However, you can see that the price was actually lower. So maybe that might be some of the effects of the discounting. But again, we kind of flagged that as something that could be looked at as part of overall revenue. So we've kind of used that in there as well with our answer. And therefore, we're going to kind of analyze this here. So we'll say that, revenue is above the prediction, but average revenue per kilogram was actually below. Maybe we could speculate that that was due to some of the discounting that we saw during the year. And of course, you could look at those on a percentage change basis as well if we wanted to, but you don't want to kind of overdo it too much on the analysis. We don't want to kind of do too much, just bring in kind of what's relevant or really relevant. So therefore, we thought about how we're going to use that. We've already used a number of clients as well. So we've got a reason here as well. There was a soft launch of the kibble range. So maybe that's, part of the reason as well. So we can kind of bring that in. Number of clients we've done this. So you can see that you're not always just given everything in like narrative format. It's not always just kind of text. You might be given additional numbers. Now, the rule is use the exam paper information as much as possible, whether that's numbers they give you, whether that's narrative information, whether that's a media article, whatever it is, use it as much as possible. Clearly, we've used a number of clients. We thought we might get this in the exam, and getting it in the exam means that we absolutely should be using it. So now we're told here, significant increase in late amendments to monthly orders from large clients across all channels. The unexpected change contributed to a 7% increase in production hours. Now, of course, we know production, that's going to relate to our cost of sales. So we'll save that for cost of sales because that's what that's impacting. And we're told about materials wastage, of course, and that's for cost of sales as well. So therefore, we'll kind of use these when we do cost of sales. You might decide that you want to, put those on now. In your answer, you might want to kind of jot them down in your plan. I'd probably leave it for now. I prefer to take it kind of one element at a time. So looking at revenue, and then I'll write up revenue, and then I'll do kind of cost of sales. You could do all the analysis first of all, but I don't think if you do revenue first of all, I don't think there's a risk that by having not looked at cost of sales and gross profit, it's going to adversely affect revenue, because obviously revenue is a top number, in the P&L. I don't think you can analyze gross profit without having looked at revenue first of all. You can do it the other way around. So I think starting with revenue and then writing revenue up is a fine approach to take in the exam. And that's certainly the way that I did it and have done it in all the subsequent exams that I have sat for case study. So we've now thought about, what our plan looks like. We've now got our numbers here for our Appendix 1. So then we can start to type up our report. So as I've said, with each of the channels, it's fairly straightforward: number, reason, further insight, context point. And we kind of thought of some of these context points already, what could be kind of quite useful here in our plan and from our AI analysis. But there could be others that we could think about, from the exam paper now as well. And you can kind of bring those in as you go through. Now, overall revenue is slightly different, because we're not going to say, overall revenue's gone up and then say, what's the reason? Because the reason that overall revenue will have changed is because the revenue in each of the individual channels has changed, and that's changed because of all of these reasons we've already talked about. So when you do overall revenue, you're not necessarily going to go into like all of the reasons, because you're going to cover that below. The reason overall revenue has, gone up is because Taylors has gone up because Taylors is making more online sales. We're going to say that Taylors is making, more online sales here when we analyze Taylors specifically. So therefore, you won't go into the specific reasons as to why each channel has gone up or down here under overall revenue. We're going to make some kind of more high level comments. So probably kind of more of those further insight trend points, really. So it's always good to say, overall revenue, has it gone up or down? And if you can comment it, make a comment, on the market performance, if we're told about that in the exam paper, or if there was something we knew from the AI. Now, what is important is, as I said, with these kind of trend points, I think, is the growth rate increasing or not? We knew in 2020 it was 2.6%. So we can see, is it increasing or not? And then we can look at like trend points, like have all channels gone up or down? So you can see, have all channels gone up or down? Well, no, that isn't relevant, because it's not as though they've all gone up. Some have gone up and some have gone down. What was a really good piece of analysis that we could perform is looking at, okay, so revenue overall might be this, but what is it excluding Taylors, that key client? And we saw in that revenue bridge that they'd excluded Taylors because it was kind of, just a single client, a large client. So we can see how the underlying business is doing. And actually, that's a really interesting point to look at, because you can see that overall the business has gone up, but excluding Taylors, it's gone down. So excluding Taylors, it had gone down. We weren't told about a particular target, so we wouldn't have commented on that. And of course, we can look at the number of clients. So is it because of an increase in the number of clients, or is it because of an increase or change in the average revenue per client? So kind of looking at this overall, and we can see when we looked at that revenue bridge, again, that was quite interesting because number of clients is up. That's having a positive impact on revenue, but the change in average revenue per client is down, and that's having a negative impact. So that's the change in average revenue, the decline in average revenue is offsetting the benefit from the increase in clients. That's really interesting to look at there. So we definitely have a point on that. And then we can think about the average discount in the year. Now, we weren't told the discount for overall. We only had it for one particular channel. We only had it for pet stores. So we didn't have it there for all of them. So again, the actual points you include depends on what information you have in what information do you have in exam information, and two, what's interesting. You can see there, I said that's quite interesting to look at what revenue is excluding Taylors, because it paints a different picture from what looking at overall revenue is. So it's really insightful analysis to have done that. Looking at the revenue bridges insightful analysis, because it's all good saying, okay, well, revenue's gone up, or excluding Taylors, it's gone down, but you can actually get to the underlying cause. Is it because of a change in clients, or is it because of a change in revenue? So you can kind of see what I mean by working with the numbers, getting that further insight points. So of course, in the AI class before, students had sat this as their mock exam as part of the course. They were quite well versed in this and looking out for these items, and these are all factors that ended up being in the real exam. So you can kind of see how well this mock exam prepared students for the actual exam. So once we've done that, we can then start typing up our report. So of course, our first section here is going to be revenue. So we're going to have revenue to begin with, and we're going to look at overall revenue. So we can say, overall revenue. Now, of course, you've got the pro forma here, but it's useful to kind of remind you of what you need to do. So overall revenue, so it's increased. Now, how are we going to describe this? Is it impressive? Well, it's gone up by 4%. I'd probably say that's kind of modest, has increased modestly, or moderately perhaps, and then you can just get the numbers. You can pick those up from your analysis. So we can see that overall revenue is up by 616K. What's that as a percentage? That's exactly 4%. And it's always good to say what it's to, I think, particularly with a key headline number like that. Key headline, overall revenue, always good to kind of just say what that is to. Now, when you look at the marking keys, it's usually that you just need the absolute increase or the percentage increase. So quite often you only need one of these numbers, but I think it's good to have both, just in case you made a mistake with one, then you get the other one at least. If you just did a typo, so if you did 661 or something like that, at least you'd have the 4% there as well, so that when you come to the marking key, you'd still get the point there. But if it's in the appendix, then you'd get the mark for it as well. But just to be on the safe side, perhaps. And it's also useful for your own analysis, because then you can kind of see, is it significant or not? But I think for these key headline numbers, so revenue, gross profit, operating profit, I think it's good to have the current year figure there. You don't always need it, but I think you'd find that in most financial reports. So then we can think, so once we've got the number, we can think, is it good or poor in the context of the industry? So we weren't really given anything new in the exam paper. We could have perhaps mentioned, some of the points that we were told. So we kind of summarize in our AI analysis, we summarize all of the, main points, but then we kind of think about, what we might have as some of our kind of context points here, those wider industry context points. Could have said, compared to 5% global growth, you could say it's a reasonable performance because it's kind of in line with that, which is reasonable performance in industry which grows at 5%. So we could have that on there. But then what we really thought was some really good points to have here would be to then start thinking about analysing these numbers in a bit more detail. So we could say excluding Taylors, what has revenue changed to? So therefore we could start, typing in exactly what revenue had changed to for Taylors, excluding Taylors. So we could see that it actually declined by 6.6%, so 815K. So we can make that point in our answer. So excluding Taylors, revenues continued to decrease from this to this. And therefore that's really interesting, as I said, because that kind of means that Taylors is like masking the underlying trend in the business, which is a decline. And then of course we can analyze it, by the number of clients, and we can look at how that's changed. So number of clients has caused an increase in revenue, whereas the change in revenue per client would have caused a decrease. So once we look at these numbers here, we could have said that there had been an increase in the number of clients overall, so that would have had a positive impact on revenue. So we can say that the increase in the number of clients would have caused a positive impact on revenue, and we did that in the revenue bridge. We saw that had a positive 310K impact, whereas the average revenue per client had gone down, so it had an adverse impact on revenue, and that kind of more than offset it. So we said in the AI class prior to this is really important to kind of look at this revenue bridge. It was really flagged in the AI. So therefore we could say there's an increase in the number of clients which caused an increase in revenue. However, the decrease in the average revenue per client caused a decrease in revenue of this, which offset the benefit of new clients. So therefore that was definitely an important point to look at there. We weren't told much about the discount, but what we were told about was new dog fit. So we could have mentioned a point there about new dog fit, and we said what revenue was, and clearly that was above the prediction of 570K, but the average revenue was below. You could look at below the prediction or below what it was in the prior year. So therefore we could have some analysis of the new dog fit numbers as well. So we can see here what our overall revenue would have looked like, and again very much in line with what we'd expected having looked at the AI. But of course you'd have to tailor these points depending on what comes up in the scenario. Maybe they didn't tell us anything about new dog fit. Maybe we weren't given a number of clients, we couldn't do this analysis. So therefore we'd have to think about some other points that we would need to include in there instead. And then we should have a context point as well. So you can see here we could have made a point about there being an increase in pet ownership as a result of COVID. So therefore that would be a good point to bring in, because that kind of affects overall revenue. People are spending more time at home, and therefore they're increasing their pets, a number of pets they own, more people own pets. Then of course that's going to boost overall revenue. So you can see these points here, they're not specific to an individual stream. This impacts overall revenue. New dog fit impacted overall revenue. When we kind of excluded Taylors, we're kind of looking at overall revenue on a high level view, rather than kind of breaking it down into like the individual parts. So, if you push for time, then you don't need to have kind of all of these points, highlighted here. Maybe just pick and choose the ones which are most relevant to the scenario based on the exam paper information. So you're always reacting to that exam paper information. You can't like pre-prepare, your whole requirement one, but you can start to think about, as we did here, as we had here with this pro forma report that students went into the exam with, we kind of thought of the points which you might consider including, depending on what information you're provided in the exam paper, and which points are interesting. This is interesting to look at this because it shows that actually you strip Taylors out, it was actually quite a poor year for the business. So then you can move on to your revenue for vets. So then you could do your revenue for vets as the next part, but we'd already thought about that. We already had that in your plan. So it'd be quite easy to kind of, type that up, revenue from vets. We saw how the number had changed. We saw that revenue from vets, that's declined, and that's disappointing. So say disappointingly, with the number, what was the reason? Well, we already said the reason there was because they lost VST and the other clients. So therefore we've got our number and our reason here as to why, vets has changed. So you can see number disappointing, here's a number, this is the reason. So number, reason. And then we need to kind of think here about a further insight point. What else were we going to say here? Well, we thought we'd look at the number, the change in clients and average revenue per client, because they both went down. So therefore we could kind of emphasize that in our answer. There's been a decrease in the number of clients and a decrease in the average revenue per client. So that was important to look at, what the average revenue per client had changed by. So you could even possibly kind of emphasize that. I mean, we've got it there, we said, and I think that's kind of quite important to say they've both gone down, so that's bad. And then again, we need to think of a context point. So a good context point, you could have come up with different context points here, but a good one here was that point that we knew from the AI. Now, the AI is quite useful for context bits because obviously the AI does give us context to the industry and what's happened in the past. So this is probably where the AI is of most use. But if there was a context point from, the exam paper, then we could have kind of brought that in as well. But if there is a point from the AI which is clearly relevant, which it is in this case, because revenue from vets has gone down, and we were told the reason it's gone down is because vet clients were acquired by larger practices. So this point from the AI that we knew that there's concentration of clients are acquiring one another and merging with one another, that's clearly having a significant impact here. And therefore that would be a relevant context point to bring in. So it's really relevant to what we're looking at here. I'm not saying here, I've picked this point up in the AI and I thought it was such a great point and I think it's really going to impact, vets kind of going forward. And therefore that's why I'm bringing it in. It's just clearly relevant to what's happened in the year. So I'm bringing the AI point in because it's clearly relevant. And of course we need number, reason, further insight point, and then a context point. And then we're going to do it again. So we're going to do it again, with pet stores. And we said here, pet stores, because of the discount, that's now 34%. Then we'll have some further analysis on the client numbers, and then we'll have a context point. So you can see that we're doing the same thing. It's the same exam technique every time. So say, pet stores revenue has gone up. So always going back to my appendix and saying, pet stores has gone up by this percent. Due to, and then it's because of those discounts of 34%, whereas we knew, of course, from the AI for the previous year, we knew, of course, that they were only 30%, and I didn't even need to look that up in the AI, and neither, would have my students, because we went through that in so much detail in the AI class. But of course, you had that there if you needed to, and you had that there as well on the pro forma report. And then we could have so we've got our number, we've got our reason, and a further insight point, so an increase in number of clients, but a decrease in average revenue per client. So you can see here that you'd have kind of one offsetting the other again, and then you could put here, the new younger generation of pet owners more likely to shop online. So therefore we could have just made that point as well, which is quite relevant, from the AI. So again, we could do the same thing for other revenue. Now, other revenue, we weren't really told a reason in the exam paper. So you could have perhaps taken the view that maybe I won't make a point about other revenue, but the exam paper asked for it by channel, and this is a channel, so therefore you did need to have something about other revenue there, and it's also fallen quite significantly. So you might have kind of struggled a bit here and thought, well, what am I going to use as my reason? Because I haven't got a reason from the exam paper. So in that case, only then would I think about going back to the AI and think, well, what happened in previous years? Why did it go down in previous years? Oh, yes, I remember now that it had been going down because it relies on in-person sales. So these are like the smaller places, like the garden centres and places like that. And if sales have moved more online, then obviously this would be declining. So again, you could start off with, okay, well, I've got my number. So I've got, other revenue, has gone down, from this to this with the percentage. Then when you start to think about your reason, if you really can't find something from the exam paper, then you could think back to the AI or possibly even kind of like speculate on a reason. But I would try to avoid speculating on a reason, but maybe go back to the AI. If you haven't got something from the exam paper, what's the most obvious reason that that channel will have gone, up or down? And of course, that's what we knew from the AI. We knew that it had gone down in the past because it relied on in-person sales. So again, you might have thought, well, I might have a little bit less analysis on this one because we're getting quite a lot down here for revenue, and we've still got to look at Taylors, and we're going to look at the mix. And usually I'd suggest having kind of like 5 points as a maximum for revenue. Because we want to get full marks, we also want to do it quickly, so we've got enough time to get full marks everywhere else as well. We don't want to have too much on revenue. So it's okay sometimes to not always have these further insight points, particularly if you're kind of running out of time and if it isn't that significant. I mean, we didn't know anything about the discount. We could possibly comment on the trend here because we could just say that the downward trend is continuing. How much had it gone down by this year? 43%. How much had it gone down by in the previous year? 38.9%. So you could say here, maybe you'd just have here as a further insight point, the downward trend is accelerating, and then have the prior year number as well, which you could have picked up from the AI. So you could have just picked that point up from the AI analysis that we had here. So we just looked at that 38.9%. So that would be a good point to have there. And then you could kind of move on, probably have more analysis on the ones which are most interesting, the bigger channels. I would say the ones which have the biggest movement. That did have a really big movement, so we absolutely shouldn't have ignored that. So again, if you think with Taylors, I think we thought about our reason for Taylors because the exam paper told us our online sales. We've got our reason there. Again, we could comment on the trend, is the growth rate accelerating here, which probably not because it was so high in that previous year because it was starting from such a low base. But that's kind of distorted that earlier year, but it certainly isn't the case that the growth trend is accelerating. So of course here, we're not really going to do that breakdown of, is it because of a change in number of clients or is it due to a change in average per client? Because there's only one client. This is a single client. So that analysis isn't of much use here. However, what we did know from the AI is because this is a big supermarket chain, they receive a higher discount and extended credit terms. So if they're getting a higher discount, actually you'd expect there to be less profit from this channel because if you're selling at a lower price effectively, but you've got the same cost, then there'll be a lower margin per product when compared with customers who have less of a discount because you have more revenue but the same cost of sales. Assuming the cost is the same, there'd probably be some economies of scales in there in the cost. But we can see that have a negative impact on gross profit margin, and the extended credit terms have a negative impact on cash. So you can kind of see here, it's almost a little bit like future impact, or it's almost kind of like a context point as well. So I can see how you think, some of these points almost get blurred. Is that a further insight point, or is that a context point, or is that a future impact point? So again, you can kind of see how it does depend on the scenario, but you can see how that would be a good piece of quality analysis and a good point to have in the answer. But again, number, reason, And then we kind of got a further insight / context point here that we know that Taylors has these increased credit terms. So that'd be a good point there. So we've got plenty here on revenue. As I said, like 4 to 5 points is usually enough. A 5 is optimal. But the other point it's always good to have when you've got various channels is looking at the mix. And we did that in our numbers as well. And that was quite interesting to see because we could see that Taylors is accounting for even more now because Taylors has grown, but some of the other channels has declined. And we kind of flagged this in the AI analysis class that actually they're becoming like increasingly dependent on Taylors. So therefore we can see that now they're becoming even more dependent on Taylors. So we could perhaps make a point about that. So a bit of number crunching almost with the mix, but you've got the prior year numbers already there in your pro forma report. But then you just need to put those kind of current year numbers in, so you can see that vets declined slightly as a percentage. Pet stores has gone up because pet stores revenue went up, Taylors up, other down. But the significance of that, and that showed that Taylors was increasing in importance. So you can see the approach now that I suggest you take with your revenue analysis, and your main approach really to requirement 1 is firstly kind of look at the numbers. We've done so much preparation on this in the AI analysis class and in the mock exams that you would have done prior to sitting your actual exam. So you'd have thought about what your appendix 1 looks like. Requirement 1 is quite predictable because we know we're going to get the latest set of management accounts. We know we're going to get these reasons here. So personally, I prefer to do the numbers first. So to work through the numbers and see what's gone up, what's gone down, calculate the changes, kind of get my numbers here ready for revenue. And then I start to work through the exam paper information, thinking, right, what's gone on in the year? What's my reason this has gone up, or what's my reason this has gone down? Start to thinking about as well, what my further insight points are going to be. So you can see as I work through that information and looked at the information the examiner gave me, I can think what's the most important analysis to conduct here for this business. Well, I've got a number of clients, so yes, I can do the revenue bridge. And I was kind of hoping this would come up because I'd thought about, I understand how this revenue bridge works and what it shows. If it didn't come up, then you wouldn't be able to do the revenue bridge, and there'd be no point kind of speculating, on it. But we can look at revenue per client, for example. So you can kind of see how using this information will kind of drive our analysis on where we're going to focus on. You can see here, reason vets is down, reason pet stores is up. We can calculate the discount. So I wouldn't go on about discounts if they didn't tell me what the discounts were or what the RRP of sales was, because you couldn't work it out. But because we could, then I'm definitely going to bring it in. So you can see how I'm reacting to the exam paper information. I haven't just pre-prepared requirement 1, and I'm just going to copy this up regardless. I've kind of thought about what things might happen in the year, and I thought about where I would include certain points, but the actual points I end up including are the ones which are most relevant based on the exam paper information and what's actually happened in the year. So I use this information to think about, which points I'm going to include, what are my reasons, and then I can start to type it up. And then you can kind of start to type it up to include those points and quickly and succinctly get through revenue while scoring lots of marks. So if you think about how this is marked and how we're scoring marks here, so what we have on the requirement 1 marking key is we'll have this here for our appendix. So you can see that we're going to have these, but we'll come back to this when we look at our overall appendix. But we can see here we've already got analysis of revenue by channels. We've kind of done that. Once we copy our appendix over, we need to have all of the 21 figures in there that we need to, but clearly we're going to have these 2. So this is quite easy to pass this box. So what we're aiming for is at least 3 points in a box, because that means we get a passing mark of SC. If you get 4, fantastic, you get the top mark of clearly competent. Now, if you get 5 or if you get 6, you get clearly competent. So actually, getting 4 is kind of optimal, really, because if you get 4, you get maximum marks. If you get 5 or 6, you get maximum marks. So actually, getting those additional points is almost like getting a point that's incorrect, because you're putting a point down and you're not getting a mark for it, which is the same as like a point which isn't on the marking key. So you can kind of see why we don't want to overdo revenue, you know, for that reason. So that's Appendix 1. So the numbers can be in the report or they can be in the appendix. So when we've got the numbers in both, and you can see I'm so thorough with the numbers. I've got them in the report, I've got them in the appendix, and I've got the absolute change and the percentage increase, because I just want to make sure I get this box, because it is an easy box, but you know, clearly we've got that there. So when I'm typing my points, you can see that I've said every time. So we look at the channels first of all: number, reason, further insight, context. Because what I'm trying to do here with vets is I'm trying to thinking, okay, well, I've got the number. Now I get the reason due to concentration of clients, loss of that client, got that mark. Then I'm trying to get the further insight point. So here it was number of clients and average revenue per client down. Fantastic, I got that. You could have looked at overall client losses or average revenue impacts. You could have done like the revenue bridge for that as well if you'd had time. So sometimes you get a backslash here, so you get, you know, if you, as long as you get one of these points, you'll get the mark. So you can see I've said number, reason, further insight, and then a context point. So what was my context point here? I said due to increased concentration of clients, price-based competition due to concentration, got that point. So you can see that each mini paragraph I'm putting down, I'm getting mark, 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 mark. And then I did the same for pet stores. So then we look at pet stores and we can see, so pet stores number, my reason was the discounts. So that's what the examiners were looking for here in this marking key. Then we've got, again, number of clients and average revenue per client. So then we've kind of looked, so you've got both of them there. So you've got the number of clients up and average revenue per client down. And we kind of pick those up there. And then a context point, younger generation of pet owners more likely to shop online. Online sales growth, should be able to pick that. Increased pet ownership. So you can see it's not exactly kind of absolutely like word for word, but you can see I've made that point. It doesn't have to be literally word for word. So younger generation of pet owners required to shop online. Probably this one, perhaps. Online sales growth. We'd get that point there. And you can see what I'm doing. So I'm just doing this for each channel, and then hopefully I'm going to get 4 points in each box at least. So you can see other revenue due to sales in person. So other number, in-person sales. Further insight point, downward trend is accelerating, decline accelerating. Didn't have a context point there. You don't need it for everyone, because remember you only need 4 overall. So that was fine. I didn't have as much for that one. Taylor's number, increase in online sales. So Taylor's number, online sales. And then we said higher than average discount and extended credit terms has an impact on gross profit in cash. Haven't got that there. So, you know, sometimes you get the point, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you make a good point and it's not on a marking key. It's kind of a little bit like tough luck, really. But that's why it's important if you're aiming for kind of like 4 or 5 here, because you only need 3 to get a passing mark. So if you're kind of like that, it's not too detrimental, because I had 5 points, I will get enough still. If you just had 3 points, you're cutting it fine, because if one of your points isn't on here, then you might not get enough to pass. And then we had the revenue mix. So you can see here, we've got the revenue mix. So we're usually quite generous here. You only really have to look at one of them. You know, maybe I've played it a bit safe here by kind of having all of them. Maybe you could have just focused on the main ones. Maybe you could have just focused on Taylor's and other, because that's declined significantly and is the smallest. This is, you know, increased probably the most, and it's the biggest. Whereas these two are just kind of a bit in the middle. Neither of them are that significant. So maybe we could have just had, you know, other and Taylor's in here to save a bit of time. We still would have got the mark. We'd focus on the most important ones. Probably a better skill there. Probably would have been better to have that in there, to be honest. Showed a bit of judgment in there. Now, I said that here, you know, Taylor's is increasing in importance. So actually that point was up there, but you'd still get the mark for it. So you can see actually, by doing this approach, we haven't looked at overall revenue yet. So we said, overall revenue. So we've got the number, reasonable performance in the context of the industry. Not on there. So again, another one a bit unfortunate. We said, excluding Taylors, what revenue had gone by. And in fact, I think I missed a point because we said here, didn't we, on our pro forma report, what was really important to look at was how it compared to the previous year. So I said the rate of growth is increasing. So that was an important point to have. And we said we'd include that. I think just when I've copied it over, I've missed it. But we can see that the rate of growth here was increasing. So that we said that was an important one to include because it's now 4%. So you can see that we would have got a mark there. So compared to industry growth, 2020 growth, so we've done that. So we've got that point there. So you can see sometimes you've got a point, then your next point isn't in there, then you've kind of got one over there. So it isn't always, number, reason, further insight, context. Sometimes you might even see a context point here. Maybe what you thought was a further insight point is in here. Maybe you find a reason in here. So it can kind of jump around a bit. But if you follow this approach, you'll pick plenty of marks up overall. So what else did we have under our overall revenue? So we had number of clients caused an increase of revenue, but there's been a decrease in average revenue, which offset that. So you'd hope that that would be on there. Average revenue per client down again, or compares to industry growth. So I actually had that point. Did we say it's down again? Maybe we didn't say it's down again. So you can see that was a bit frustrating. I didn't get that point. This is also frustrating because I got these 2 points, but they're the same point. They're the same mark. So that can be quite frustrating when there's a backslash. Sometimes the backslashes are nice because you've got more options to hit that point, more opportunity to hit that point. But then if you kind of get several of them, you're only getting 1 mark still. But that's just the way it goes with case study. And then we had all this analysis on new dog fit as well. And we made a context point about COVID. So our further analysis points on new dog fit. So you can see here, good analysis here that, had those points in there, but already hit maximum marks. So again, that's a little bit frustrating as well. So it's really important you get familiar with this marking key because you can really kind of understand, how it's marked, how you get the points, how many points you need to get. And it's good that when you mark your answer after having done it, you can appreciate these frustrations like I am now. That's frustrating that I got those 2 points, but they only get me 1 mark. And it's also frustrating that, I picked up and I said that this offsets the benefit of the new clients. So I thought that was a really good point that, average revenue is down and that's offsetting the benefit of the clients. Increases, but that's kind of not on there. That point was on there, so we kind of got that context point. We mentioned COVID as well, which was still quite irrelevant at the time of this exam. So you can really start to appreciate and see how it's marked and also some of the frustrations that you may experience with your answer. But you can see because I've kind of got so many points, it was fine, and I've got a clearly competent in all of the boxes I was kind of targeting here. And in fact, I've already got a clearly competent in the wider context, even though we haven't done the cost of sales and the gross profit yet. So you can see what we're trying to do here with revenue. Broadly, we're saying number, reason, further insight, context, because we're trying to hit points in these boxes. And therefore, we're trying to hit those points. And if we can get enough points in those, you can see you can come out here with 4 boxes already. We'll talk about marking at the end of the requirement, but we only need to get 6 out of the 11 to pass. We've already landed 4. This is going to be quite easy. So then we're at 5. Conclusions is quite easy. So you can kind of see that actually a really good revenue section can kind of get you well on your way. But what is really important is that you stick to time on revenue and you kind of appreciate that having more isn't better, because if you've already got to 4, you've already got maximum marks. So there's probably an argument to say that, maybe my exam technique was almost a little bit bad here just because I've kind of got too much really. But having said that, if you can get this done within the time, then it's better to have too much, obviously, than being a bit borderline, even if you do have some points where you've already maxed out in a box, because you don't know exactly what the boxes are going to look like and which points are in which. But I think, if you have 5 maximum, absolute maximum of 6 mini paragraphs for revenue, then you're going to get the full marks. I'd say between 4 and 6, I'd probably say 5 is probably optimal. But I felt as I really wanted to have some points on UDOG Fit, of course, because it was given in the exam paper. So it's important to really kind of appreciate kind of how it's marked and why having loads and loads of revenue is unlikely to be of additional benefit. But then, of course, you need to have a sufficient amount. So you need to have at least 4 mini paragraphs on it, perhaps optimally 5. So you can start to see now how this exam technique can be used in order to score you, very high marks, and 100% of the marks available there for revenue. And we're going to follow a similar approach with the other parts of requirement 1. So once we'd completed our revenue analysis, we could then move on to cost of sales. Now you'll see that it asks for total cost of sales. So with revenue, it said for each channel and in total. And I said, even if it just asks for revenue in total, and it might have just said it should cover revenue and didn't have anything here at all, even if it just asked you to cover revenue or it just said cover it in total, you would still have an analysis by channel, because we want to identify all the reasons why revenue has gone up, and therefore that will require us to look at it by each individual channel. So with cost of sales, even though it said total cost of sales, we're still going to want to look at the movement in the individual cost lines. Just as if it said for revenue in total, we would still look at and include comments on and have mini paragraphs on all the individual channels. So with cost of sales, it's asking us to analyze the total cost of sales, but really to undertake a meaningful analysis of total cost of sales, we need to look at the individual lines. We need to look at those individual costs. So therefore, we'd approach this in the same way as we did for revenue. So we could start off, first of all, by taking the current year numbers and copying them over into our appendices, so into our Appendix 1. And then we've got the prior year numbers, which of course come from our AI analysis documents. We've got those, and we've already thought about how we're going to lay out our Appendix 1. So we've got this in exactly the same format as we're going to lay it out in, so nice and easy to do that. Calculate the differences, look at the percentage change, and of course, once you get that first row in the formula right, you can just drag it down. And then just a quick sense check, does that look right? Your materials, they have gone up, maybe just spot check one of them, and that was it in the prior year. This is what it was in the current year. Maybe just double check the total. Yeah, that looks correct. That's just summing those. So a bit of sense check of your work. And then you can see, yes, all of these look sensible in terms of the percentage movements. They're all an increase. Yes, that looks, reasonable. Yes, that's, below 10%. So yes, that again looks sensible. And then we can also look at the cost as a percentage of revenue. So this was mentioned in the AI a few times, one way of looking at the cost of sales. And I suggested this was a good way to do this. So in the pro forma report, we had included comments here looking at what percentage of revenue each cost was. But again, if you get the first row right, then you can just drag it down. So prior year, you could do it with the numbers here in the spreadsheet, and then you're kind of just double checking that your formula's right here. So it must be right there, assuming you have adjusted it for the total cost of sales, and therefore you've got it as a percentage of the total revenue. So you've got the cost of sales line over the total revenue. So once you've kind of got that for each year, so you can see we've got it for the right year here, and then you can just kind of drag it down. You can check those prior year numbers, and you can just have a look back to your where you'd calculate them as part of the AI analysis, and we can see here that these numbers are the same. So therefore, our formula is clearly correct. So therefore, we've copied the formula over, then it's correct there as well. Now, of course, the AI flagged about materials wastage. So therefore we could look at how much the materials wastage was. We knew in the prior year it was 601, 9.7%. And in the exam paper information here, we were told that it is now the new percentage of 10.2%. So therefore we could actually calculate what the materials wastage is. So we could look at that as well. It's a very similar way to approach it. You can copy the current year numbers over. You've got the prior year numbers in the AI analysis. Then you could possibly look at mix like we did with revenue, but perhaps more importantly here, looking at these costs as a percentage of revenue. And you can see that they're all increasing, and you can see that costs are going up faster than revenue. And then specific to this company, we can look at materials wastage. And we said in the AI analysis class, I flagged several times to students sitting this exam how important this was to look at this here. So once we've done that, we'll follow a similar approach to what we did for revenue. And for each cost line, we'll say, has it gone up or down? What's the reason? Can we give some further insight? So for materials, we could look at wastage. Do we have a context point perhaps as well? Perhaps not for materials, but we could do materials, number, reason, and therefore there's a few kind of further insight points we could have here. So you can see how the number and the reason are quite easy, because we could just have, the number here, materials have gone up, and maybe the reason here we'd actually say, the reason is because of the wastage, which is now above the target or continues to be above the target. And then we've got labour. So we've got labour. So what's our reason here going to be for labour? We were told that this caused an increase in production hours. So that would have increased labour costs. And it would also be a reason as well, perhaps, why overheads have gone up as well. So you could possibly use that reason either here or here. And maybe we could kind of just think back to the AI to maybe get some more reasons, because we didn't have a huge amount on the exam paper for cost of sales. We were told here about an increase in production hours. We've got the wastage, but we didn't really have much else there. So, the late amendments in monthly orders caused the increase in production hours. But maybe we could kind of think, was there anything else we knew from the AI which would have caused these costs to go up? Of course, we did know from the AI that there were going to be like new product variants, because we knew that New Dog Fit, they were looking at launching new variants. And of course, we were told this up here that there were those new variants as well. So that could be another reason that we use there. So again, trying to use the exam paper information as much as we can, but if we're struggling to find enough reasons, then we could go back and use some reasons from the AI. But our exam technique is exactly the same: number, reason, further insight point, and then context as well, if we can. But again, you can see the pro forma report really would have kind of guided you here, and it helps you kind of think of the types of points that we would include here. So when you look at it, cost of sales, by each line, for each, we'd have number, so it's up, reason, so in this case wastage, further insight point, materials as a percentage of revenue. So labour, number, reason, production hours increase, further insight point as a percentage of revenue. And then again with overheads. Now, as we did for overall revenue, we could have a comment on overall cost of sales. So we could say it's gone up, and then again, if we've got a specific reason as to why they all went up, you could include it here. But what we would perhaps instead say is more of a trend point, saying it's because all costs have gone up. Like with overall revenue, we said what we would say here is, overall revenue has gone up because all channels have gone up, or all revenue streams have gone up. So you're kind of looking at an overall kind of trend point there. And then what we should really do as a further insight point is to identify whether these costs are going up faster or slower than revenue. Because if your cost of sales are going up faster than your revenue, that's going to cause your profit margin to fall. revenue minus cost equals profit. If your costs are going up faster than your revenue, your profit margin is going to fall. So we could make that point there, because in this case, cost of sales has gone up. Again, we've got the number, that's the easy bit. We've said an increase in all costs, and then we can say as well, they've gone up faster than revenue, which will have a negative impact on the gross profit margin. So you can see here, same exam technique, number, reason, further insight, context point. See, not always we can come up with a context point, and as I demonstrated on the marking key, we only really need about 5 across the whole paper. So we've already kind of got a few good ones already with revenue. So in fact, we've already passed that box. So if you can't always think of a context point, don't worry too much. Just make sure that you've got about 4 or 5 across the whole paper. And if you're having 5 points for revenue, 4 or 5 points for cost of sales, a few points for gross profit, you don't need one at the end of each. Therefore, our cost of sales analysis is then complete. So that definitely needed its own heading, because it was specifically asked for in the requirement. So you could do cost of sales and gross profit together, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. So that's one way of doing it. You could do cost of sales and gross profit together and just merge them under one heading, but just make sure that you're going to need plenty of points on cost of sales, because it's specifically asked for in the requirement. So that's why I probably would give it its own heading in this case, if it's specifically called out in the requirement wording. And even if it just asked you for revenue and gross profit, you'd still need to look at cost of sales, because you wouldn't be able to analyze gross profit without looking at cost of sales, because gross profit might have gone up or down, but what's happened to the costs, particularly in relation to revenue, will be the reason why the profit margin has gone up or down. So then we can start to look at gross profit. Now, this company didn't have gross profit by channel. We just had a total gross profit number here for the whole business. So we thought about how we would do this when we'd looked at this in the advanced information class. Now, when you're looking at gross profit, yes, we can make a comment overall about the overall gross profit. So you could do the revenue minus the cost of sales. You could do that as a quick sense check to make sure you've calculated it correctly, or you could of course just take the number from the face of the financial statements. We had got the gross profit figure there in the exam paper, but maybe just kind of a good control check here would be to take your total revenue minus the cost of sales to make sure that you've calculated that correctly. So yes, we could comment on gross profit overall has gone down, but what's really more meaningful is looking at the margin. Now you can see that the gross profit margin has declined. So what that's telling us is that costs are increasing faster than revenue. And we'd already kind of identified that already. So we could mention that, as one of our points, but we really want to get into the commercial reasons as to why are costs going up faster than revenue. So one point would be the increased discounts, because if revenue is decreasing because you're selling your goods for a lower selling price, but your costs are not only staying the same, but increasing because there's more production runs and costs are going up, then that's going to erode the margin. A change in revenue mix would also impact it if one revenue stream has got a different profit margin than the other. So we knew that Taylors had a higher discount, and therefore if revenue shifts towards Taylors, then overall, then the gross profit margin would fall, because you think Taylors has got a lower gross profit margin because it's got more, that customer receives more of a discount. All costs increasing as a percentage of revenue. We've already identified that. We've already mentioned that here, that is causing that gross profit margin fall. And if it continues to fall, you could say that it's unsustainable for gross profit to continue falling, because of course it will eventually start earning a loss, and maybe even after we've deducted all of the operating costs, which we're not looking in this exact requirement, but then maybe after then they would start to make a loss because of this. So therefore we could have our gross profit point. So again, gross profit decrease, give a bit of an opinion there, disappointingly. So again, we've got the number, we've got the absolute number here, but what's important is looking at the gross profit margin. And we can see it's gone down, and then there's always getting a reason. So there's more discounts. There's a revenue shift towards Taylors, which has a higher discount. We know, of course, when we looked at our revenue, that a greater proportion of revenue is coming from Taylors, which has a higher discount and therefore lower margin. Poor control of costs, and all of the cost of sales line are increasing as a percentage of revenue. So therefore, we've got number, reason, and then a further insight point that this continued decline is concerning and unsustainable. So you can see, similar approach there with gross profit. And, like I said, you could have it, cost of sales and, gross profit. You could put them together here, because even if you were analyzing, gross profit, you'd still need to look at cost of sales. But, same exam technique in terms of, number, reason, further insight point, context point, if you can get one. Just a slight tweak in terms of like the gross profit, just make sure you're focusing on that margin. You're not too descriptive here, just saying gross profit overall. And what you certainly shouldn't always do is just say, gross profit overall has gone down because, revenue has gone up, but cost of sales, has gone up. I mean, you could say, so you don't be too kind of descriptive. It is valid to say that, all costs are increasing as a percentage of revenue, which in a way is kind of saying, the same thing, but there's a bit more kind of in-depth analysis there, but always trying to look for the commercial reasons as well. So because of increased discounts, because that's causing revenue to fall, or certainly causing revenue to not increase as much as costs. Revenue shift towards Taylors, which has a higher discount. So really trying to find these commercial reasons as to why the gross profit margin has changed, rather than just trying to explain a number, with another number. Again, you can see here, concise, straight to the point, using that exam paper information as much as possible. We were told about discounts. When we looked at the revenue mix figures, we saw this shift towards Taylors. We've looked at our cost of sales as a percentage of revenue. So we can see how we've brought that analysis in there using that exam paper information. And again, we're doing the same thing here. So with our cost of sales, we're saying number, we got that. We didn't have so much of a reason for overall cost of sales, but we compared it to revenue. So compare cost of sales or the fall in gross profit to revenue, which we did. So materials, you can see here we've got materials, number. Then we've got reason was because of wastage. And then we've got further insight point. So again, I've got both of those, but only got one mark. So you can see again, that slight frustration, sometimes with a backslash, but sometimes it can be a bit of a lifesaver as well if you've only got one of them, or there's 4 or 5 backslashes and you think, I haven't got this point, and you go all the way through and then you get the final one. So it swings both ways, really. So we've got labor, again, number, production, hours. So you can kind of see the same technique every time. We're just racking up the marks. So it's a bit easier here because the numbers are in this box rather than being here. This was like number, reason, further insight. This is more kind of number, reason / further insight. So you can see how things kind of move around a bit. And then we did overheads as well. So you can kind of see that, if you were running out of time and you thought, well, I'm not going to do overheads because they've got the least significant movement, maybe not, or maybe because there isn't as much to say about them, couldn't really think of a reason, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to focus on these ones. That would be the right thing to do, because these ones, I think you should have them in there because there was a reason from the exam paper. As soon as I, saw this in here, I thought, well, I've got, some information from the exam paper here about materials, and I've got something in here as well, kind of about labor hours. Then I'm thinking, well, I definitely want to make sure I can use these in my answers. So the best way to use them is make sure I have a mini paragraph on labor and materials. So I'd prioritize those over overhead. So if you didn't have time, or you were running out of time, then maybe skip overheads because there wasn't a reason from the exam paper there. And then gross profit. So gross profit down, always focus on the margin, but you get the number for the absolute as well. Serious concern, discount, all costs increasing. So I put loads of reasons in there. but I wanted to because there was so much I'd kind of identified, and that's really interesting analysis. I think, you know, the examiner set the papers up in such a way so there's something interesting to find out, and I thought all of that was interesting, that, you know, discounts were increasing, so I realized that that was going to have an impact. All costs were going up, so clearly that was going to have an impact as well. So again, you can see there we are, that's those two. I mean, we've got overheads as well. So you can see you really didn't need the overheads. You still could have got clearly competent, but good to have them if you did, in case you made a mistake here, or you know, there was only 4 points in the box, or if some of them are more backslash. So it's always good to have a bit more if you can, give you a bit of a margin of safety. But you can see that, you know, you don't always need everything to get to the full marks, and much more important that you finish the exam on time. So as you can see, the first part of requirement 1 can be fairly well rehearsed in advance of the exam. All case study exams have required an analysis of revenue and some level of profit. And if you're familiar with the AI and the various channels or revenue streams or divisions or sites, or however this business is structured and therefore reports its financial information, you can start to think well in advance of what this section might look like. And whilst we're always going to react to the exam paper, you can probably start to think about what some of your further insight points might be and what some of your context points might be, which is why we developed this pro forma for our students to use in the exam, just to remind them how to structure their report, their financial analysis, analysing the performance and the types of points to consider including. This is a really handy resource to have on exam day, and lots of our students have found this to be particularly useful. So when practicing this in conjunction with the mock exams that we produce, you can get really quick at this part of requirement 1. And that's really important because there is a lot to cover. As you've seen there's a lot of analysis to get through. And the more you can get through and the more points you can have, the more marks you're going to score, and therefore increase your chance of getting clearly competent in all of these boxes. And you can see actually that you'd be able to get enough here now to pass the requirement just on this first part of requirement 1. However, there is a second part to requirement 1, which is less predictable. So we usually have an additional issue in requirement 1, not always, but most case study exams do. And this tends to be a bit more unpredictable. So it could be something like a staff issue or a product recall. It really does vary across case studies based on, you know, the nature of the business. So it quite often requires an additional calculation or an additional piece of analysis. So we may have to calculate the impact of, for example, a product recall or a bad debt write-off. And then we can look at the impact on the accounts. And then we can look at a revised profit figure, perhaps. So we could then discuss the significance of the calculation. So maybe it would turn a profit to a loss, for example, or maybe it isn't significant at all. And there could also be some ethical issues tied in there as well, if ethics comes into requirement 1. Tends to be in requirement 2 or 3, but can be in requirement 1 as well. So the exam exhibits will provide us an explanation of the issue and the things we need to do. And the AI may give us some context to the issue. But it can also be the case that it is an entirely new issue, but there's usually some sort of context that's been provided in the AI. So if we look at the requirement here, we can see as part of requirement 1, you should also include a response to the request for advice concerning the KPI issue in Exhibit 2. So therefore, there's been a request for advice regarding the KPI issue in Exhibit 20. So you can see here as a separate part, we have this bit down here, KPI issue. So I didn't look through the information yet. So when I read the requirement as a whole, what I would have done is I would have read the whole requirement. But I would have looked and thought, oh, this is the additional bit for requirement 1. You know, I'll tackle this after I've done the main part of the analysis. And I can see it's a separate part here. So I'm not going to read through all of this just yet. because I'll look at this when I come onto it. However, you may decide you might want to have a quick skim through it just to make sure that there isn't anything in here which is going to impact your analysis of the performance. Now, in all previous case study exams, it's always been the case that this is kind of like a separate additional issue. There was only one case study many years ago now where you were required to adjust the accounts before analysing them, but that was some time ago and we haven't seen that since. So we think it's more likely that this will continue to be an additional requirement and separate, and therefore not have an impact on your analysis. But you might want to have a quick skim through it just to see what it is. So we're told here that Louis Bailey has advised me that during Hugh Logan's quarterly performance review on this date, he raised concern that his average revenue was considerably lower than the company average and that other members of the sales team. So Hugh has been told, so Louis Bailey has advised me, so this has gone to Preet Sharma, the finance director. So during Hugh Logan's quarterly performance review, now we knew a lot about Hugh from the AI. So we knew that there was a separate exhibit on Hugh, and Hugh was unhappy about various things around the commission structure and how Charlie was managing Taylors, Charlie Bailey. And then we were also able to identify some of the issues with the KPIs as well. So Hugh's average revenue was considerably lower than the company average and other members of the sales team. So Hugh claimed that other members of the team had been offering excessive discounts and credit terms to clients in order to improve their own performance assessment. So Hugh had said that other members of the team, of the sales and business development team, had been offering excessive discounts and credit terms in order to improve their own performance assessment. So Hugh also stated that if the commission structure is not changed within the next 2 months, he will return to his former employer and take one of his clients with him. So we need to find out if the allegations made by Hugh can be substantiated and decide what actions DGS should take. So we usually have to come up with some recommendations, some action points, and we need to find out if the allegations can be substantiated. Now, of course, we have seen that discounts have gone up. So therefore, we can see that that is a possible issue here. And we could even, if we looked at credit terms, we could even possibly look at receivables and receivables days, and again to see whether those have gone up, because that would indicate that credit terms have been extended. And it wouldn't necessarily mean that they're excessive, because we were told here that the parameters of discount had been extended, and maybe credit terms had been extended as well. We're not quite clear exactly there. So this is a bit more unpredictable. So you can see with this question, we didn't need anything here on operating profit because we weren't asked for that in the exam paper. But we've got this additional analysis. So whatever that's called in the requirement should be your heading. So therefore, what we've got here is KPI issue. So we can see with this particular issue, it was quite flagged in the AI. This was clearly an issue, and we spent a lot of time in the AI analysis talking about this and how this might develop in the exam. So this usually takes up 2 boxes on the marking key. So therefore, we're going to want to get 5 or 6 different points here, and hoping if we've got 5 or 6 kind of mini paragraphs, then hopefully we'll kind of pick up kind of 7 or 8 points here. So if there are any numbers that can be calculated, we should look to bring those in. We should look at the significance and the impact on the accounts, the business impact, and possibly some skepticism as well around some of the information we're being told. So maybe we could bring in some points around Hugh and maybe be skeptical of some of the information that Hugh has told us. And we want to aim for kind of 3 or 4 action points here, because that's what we were asked for to come up with. Now, you could have these with your recommendations further down below, as we have with our overall recommendations, or you could have them here. Personally, I like to have them here because as I go through the issue and I think of the recommendations as I go through, I just put them on. But that is entirely up to you. So we're not actually asked to calculate any numbers here with this particular one. We're not asked to calculate any numbers, but we could think, of ourselves of some of the numbers that we could look at here. So we know, for example, that gross profit margin has fallen, and we know that discounts have been increasing. So we know that discounts certainly have been increasing. And that's caused a fall in the gross profit margin. So that's one of the consequences of that. But we certainly seen a case that discounts have been increasing. So we could make that as one of our points. So we're trying to get between kind of 4 and 8 points here. So looking to kind of score around kind of 6 to 8 marks. However, we know that those discounts were permitted by Louis Bailey, so we could make a point about that as well. But we know that other factors have been there at play as well. So we could say the fall in the gross profit margin and the increase in the average discount on pet store sales show that discounts have increased. So that kind of supports what Hugh is claiming. But then we've got as a separate point, however, increased discounts were permitted by Louis Bailey and other factors also explain the decline in gross profit margin. So rather than having to calculate some specific numbers here, we've kind of got this claim, but we can kind of use the numbers in the financial statements, in the management accounts, to assess whether this claim is valid or not. So actually, you can see the fact that, yes, discounts have increased. That seems to kind of support it. And there's been a fall in the gross profit margin. That kind of seems to suggest that there is some substance to Hugh's claim. However, these discounts were permitted by Louis Bailey. So that suggests that, staff aren't doing anything which they aren't allowed to. And also there were other factors causing the gross profit margin to fall as well. So again, the claims by Hugh were kind of twofold: excessive discounts and extended credit terms. So the other thing we could look at as well, we could look at trade receivables days. We could include this in our appendix. So we could look at trade receivables days. And we did include some of this in our analysis in the AI. So we could have picked up our receivables days from when we'd looked at that previously. So we could see that the trade receivables days, what they had been in the prior period. So we can see that they had been 40. And if we calculated them again for 2021, in the same way, then we could of course see that they had increased. So again, that would seem to suggest that there is some substance to what Hugh is saying, because Hugh is saying here that credit terms have been extended. So this does suggest that extended credit terms have been offered. But again, there are some other factors here, because we'd expect receivables days to go up because more sales are being made to Taylors. We said Taylors now accounts for a larger share of revenue, and Taylors gets extended credit terms compared to other clients. So therefore, that's a reason why it's gone up. So it wasn't kind of quite clear. So the other issues that we had here, so what we're really being told as well is that, Hugh's saying if the commission structure, isn't changed, he will return to his former employer. So we could also mention perhaps a context point here as well. So we were told in the AI, and we knew from the AI, that Hugh had previously complained about this. So this would be a relevant point to bring in from the AI, because Hugh had complained that the commission structure is unfair. He complained about a few other things as well, but that was one of the points he had complained about, that the commission structure and the performance measures were unfair. And he's kind of complained about it against here. So if the commission structure is not changed, then he's going to return to his former employer. Now, he's also mentioned other things as well about these clients before. So he said he's going to take, Pets in Paradise with him. So one of the other things he'd mentioned, previously before as well, is that these clients weren't being well looked after and that they had complained to Hugh about the quality of service and that DGS does not understand their needs. So again, we could have a point here saying that Hugh Logan previously raised concerns that they weren't being serviced well. So they'd already lost VST during the year. So therefore they could be losing Pets in Paradise soon as well. Because don't forget, VST had already left in the year that we're looking at here. So this part of the requirement I think is harder. One, because it's more unpredictable. And then in terms of the points to include, you have to kind of think quite carefully about, firstly, are there any numbers you need to calculate? And that's quite common to have some numbers like a product recall or a bad debt. You can work out how much needs to be written off as an expense, and then you can look at the impact on profit, look at the impact on profit margin. So that's not too difficult to do. This was probably quite a tricky one because you weren't asked to calculate any numbers. You were told about an issue, but you could use the numbers to kind of see whether these claims being made were valid or not. And actually receivable days had gone up, and discounts had gone up, and gross profit margin had gone down, and that indicates that discounts are going up. However, it needed some skepticism because there are other factors which were causing gross profit to go down, and discounting was permitted in a response to losing clients. And also, receivables days were going up because of Taylors. So therefore, it requires you to look at both sides of the issue and exercise some skepticism about some of these claims being made by Hugh, the source of the information. And then you could think as well, what do we know from the AI? Well, Hugh's previously complained about this issue, so that was a relevant point to bring in from the AI because it's clearly relevant to this issue. And of course, we knew from the exam paper that VST had left in the year. And we know that these two clients that Hugh had originally brought with him when he'd left from PAW to come to DGS, we know he brought these two clients with him and that they have complained that they weren't quite happy with how things were going. So you can kind of see here, if you kind of get like about four to 5 points here and then a few recommendations. So, I mean, what would we do here? But we could look at the discounts and which were given and compare them with the parameters to see whether people are given excessive discounts. Are the other sales staff actually given excessive discounts? I mean, the only way you could really determine that would be to actually look at the amounts of discounts and look at what's kind of permitted that the sales and business development director, Louis Bailey, permitted. Now, one of the things we mentioned and discussed quite a lot in the AI would be some sensible KPIs that could be taken into account. So we saw that they were all like revenue based, so therefore they encourage discounting. So a good recommendation would be to change them so that profit and cash are considered as well. And then another good one would be, seek legal advice or obtain legal advice to see what's going to happen to prevent, Hugh taking these clients back with him. So they were some sensible recommendations there. So hopefully you can kind of see how to approach this issue, but it is tricky. It is the hardest bit in requirement 1, in my opinion. And therefore you can see actually it's really important to get like the bulk of requirement 1 done really well, your financial analysis, have a good attempt at this and move on. Now, if we just step back and just have a think about things here, remember I said we need 6 boxes to pass this requirement, okay? Once we've copied our appendix over, which has all our figures in it, we would have passed this box as well. So you can see actually if you've done a really good analysis of revenue and profit, you may have already got enough boxes you need to pass this requirement because you can see here I'm on 7. And conclusions aren't too difficult, as we'll see. So we're going to kind of be on 8 here. So therefore getting clearly competent in these, or even sufficiently competent, isn't essential. And remember, let's look at the whole picture of case study. You have to pass each requirement in isolation and the executive summary in isolation. So balance is key. So what you absolutely need to avoid doing is being sucked into this and spending too much time on this and overrunning on requirement 1 to the detriment of requirement 2 and 3. It's no good getting all 11 boxes clearly competent here, but then not attempting requirement 3. You'll fail the exam. Instead, it's much better to get 6 or 7 here and 6 or 7 in the other 2 requirements as well. You need to pass each of them in isolation. So assuming you've done well on your analysis here, you don't need to perfect these in order to pass. You should definitely have a good attempt at them. So you definitely want to have a good attempt, make sure you pick up, 1 or 2 points so you avoid a not attempted. But even if you just got 1 point in each, stuck to time, finish this, then you'll be in a really good position. Now, you shouldn't just not attempt this at all. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you can only think of maybe 2 or 3 points, okay, that's fine. Don't sit there worrying. And if you can't get the numbers quite right, don't restart it if it means you're going to overrun on time. So don't overrun on this part. Keep it short, keep it brief, attempt it. 1, because you want to avoid a not attempted, and you shouldn't, just not do something that's been requested. And 2, you're going to need a couple of points for your conclusions and your exec summary. And you want to try and identify what the kind of big picture issue is here as well for that. So it's not that you shouldn't attempt it, but even if you only got, 2 points, 1 might be a bit extreme, but if you only kind of got 2 points and a couple of recommendations, that really isn't the end of the world. What is, a real problem here, and what could cause you to fail, is if you spend too long on this, so you completely overrun on requirement 1 and therefore don't have enough time for requirement 2 and requirement 3, could you then fail requirement 2 and or 3 and fail the exam? So that'd be a really good attempt at the issue. And you can see, how we'd have picked up marks there. The KPIs are based on revenue, so there's a context point there. You can kind of see here how looking at these points would have ensured that we got up to passing marks there. So we'll have some recommendations in here. We'll get some of the easier points in here, complaints about the commission structure, looking at some of the basic numbers. But then here we'll have more of the difficult evaluation points and the recommendations. So investigate the reports, other factors which could have been a cause there, looking at both sides of it, like we said. But again, there's always a few kind of easy recommendations like seeking legal advice as well. But you can see here with that one, I would have got enough there, I think, to get me up to clearly competent in each. So then we get on to our conclusions. Now, it's really important that we're really thorough here with our conclusions. So you can kind of think of conclusions as doing 2 things, and maybe it's useful to actually think of them doing both of these things. So you could think of conclusions as needing a conclusion on every section. So you need a conclusion on revenue, a conclusion on cost of sales, a conclusion on gross profit, and a conclusion on the KPI issue. So you need to conclude on every section. Now, every section, of course, has been based on the requirement wording. So you're kind of concluding on everything you've been asked to. But of course, that is the same thing, because we said, this is what you've been asked for: revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, KPI issue. So you need a conclusion on each of those. But, those were the things we were asked to do. And that's why I always make sure I am explicitly answering what's been asked for. So that's why I use these as my headings: revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, and KPI issue. I use those as the headings in my report, and I have 4 to 5 points for each. So when you come to your conclusions, you can kind of think, okay, well, I just need to make sure I conclude on everything that the question's asked for. So revenue by channel in total, cost of sales, gross profit, and a KPI issue. Of course, another way of doing the same thing is just make sure you conclude on every section, because all of your sections are based on that requirement wording. So you can see how important the requirement wording is. And I focus so much on the requirement wording all the time. I read it several times over, make sure that I've got a heading for everything that the requirements ask for, so that I answer exactly what the examiner's asked for. That keeps me focused by having that as my heading. So therefore, to have a conclusion on each of them. Now, of course, a conclusion is just going to be kind of taking the main points, or overall concluding on what the issues are. Now, of course, if you're looking at revenue, The main points is that, revenue's gone up modestly. This is the movement by channel as well. So you could type your conclusions, from scratch. The only thing is, if you do that, they're not going to look any different because these are like facts. Overall revenue went up by 4%, by 616K to 15.997 million. So that's kind of a fact. So even if I, retype that, it's just going to look exactly the same. So, in terms of like using technology, of course, in a very simple way, we could, of course, just copy and paste the main point from above. So we could just copy the point on overall revenue. Now, of course, we need it by each channel because that's what the requirement asks for. Now, you shouldn't copy your whole section over because then it's not a conclusion. So just copy like the main point, the key headline number for each channel. So overall and for each channel. So we want to keep the conclusions brief. They certainly shouldn't be as long as the main body in the report, because otherwise it's just, you're just repeating, what you've already got. It's not a conclusion. So you probably want to just kind of conclude and just say, overall revenue is this from this. This is a reasonable performance. Now you could have, revenue from vets increased disappointingly. You could have the reason for a couple of them, or if you wanted to keep it, even shorter, maybe you wouldn't, have the reason for, some of the smaller ones, maybe other perhaps. But you can see that we want to have those main headline numbers in there. So to conclude on each individual revenue stream, you need to have the numbers in there. We're accountants. We need to be really thorough with the numbers. So we need the numbers in there, but we don't want it too long. So probably just having the number and the reason is sufficient there for the conclusion. So that would be our conclusion on revenue. Now, for our cost of sales, the question didn't ask for it for each individual line. So we did that as part of our full body analysis. But we could here just have a brief conclusion that it's gone up, all costs have gone up, and that's gone up faster than revenue. So that's kind of a good conclusion on cost of sales. That's the main point around cost of sales. All costs have gone up, and they've increased faster than revenue, and this is what they've gone up by. That's the main conclusion on cost of sales. That's the kind of the big picture for the year. Just like from revenue, we've got our main points here. How much it's gone up by, that's kind of the key headline number that you'd want in a conclusion. All of the further analysis points, you probably wouldn't really have in a conclusion. We're looking here more for like the headline overall picture. And then with gross profit as well. So we said, gross profit is down disappointingly. The margin's really important. Maybe we'd have all of our reasons in there. Maybe we'd have quite a significant conclusion on gross profit, because all of these are quite important. But the key headline number, the key point to conclude here really with gross profit is that the margin has gone down. So maybe we just have the main reason here rather than all of them. Maybe you could say it's due to increased discounts. We're not really kind of quite clear what the main reason is, because we weren't able to dig into the detail quite as much. And then we need a conclusion on the KPI issue. So you could probably think here, kind of what's our most important point? Maybe the most important point, perhaps, it was asking about the KPI issue. So, this is probably one of the biggest threats to the business. But maybe we could say that the fall in gross profit and the increase in the discount shows that discounts have increased, because that is kind of true. So that's kind of supporting Hugh's argument. But we could perhaps here say, however, these were permitted by Louis Bailey and other factors have kind of played a part in those. So we can maybe add that in there as well to kind of qualify it. It's kind of got both sides of the argument. So we've ended up with kind of 2 points here. We never really got to a firm conclusion on whether Hugh's correct or not. We can't really know until we actually look at the discounts and look at some of the numbers. So you can see with the conclusions, you're kind of just taking the main point for each section, because you're just concluding on each section. So what's on the main overall point? And you could type them from scratch if you wanted to, or you could kind of take them as they are and maybe like tweak them a bit. I think the fact is, though, that if you're concluding on something, there's going to be nothing new in here that wasn't in the main body of the report. And if we're looking at kind of factual numbers, so cost of sales has gone up by X to X, then that's going to be the same however you write it, because it's a fact. So you could perhaps kind of copy those over as your starting point to the conclusions, and you may decide that you want to kind of tweak it slightly. And then we need our overall recommendations. So as I said, we could have put our KPI recommendations under here as well, but remember that those were part of this box. So we've got like our almost normal recommendations, our commercial recommendations, and all of this. So our recommendations following on our analysis of revenue, our recommendations following on our analysis of cost of sales and gross profit. So it's quite often the case that the management accounts don't give us all of the information we need. So what we'd really kind of like here would be like a profit analysis by channel, because we don't have that. We only had gross profit in total. It'd be quite good to see a profit analysis by channel. So that would have been a really good recommendation to have. So further analysis, of each channel. You could even say, by customer, because we didn't have it like broken down by customer for vet, pet stores, etc. Or profit analysis by channel. That was always a good one to have, or by clients. You could have combined that on there. So a good thing to always do is look at which one's doing well and which one isn't doing so well, and maybe like investigate decline in channel, maybe other that isn't doing well. So you could say investigate reasons for decline in other, particularly because we weren't given a reason in the exam paper as to why that had gone down. We just kind of speculated. So that would be a good point to have there as well. Now we've seen that margins have been under pressure. So margins have been declining. So we've kind of thought of a couple of there for revenue. So it'd be nice to have it by customer, investigate the decline in other. So if you think about profit as well, we've seen that margins are under pressure. So what they could do is start selling direct to customer, direct to the consumer. Now we saw this in the AI. So this is kind of a really good kind of recommendation to have here to help them escape that pressure on margins, because we were told in the AI that this would result in higher profit margins. So we could, of course, bring in some of these others, so reassess any changes that they've made in pricing or credit policy or discounting. So that was kind of quite relevant there as well with discounts. So reassess changes in discounts. So that one was quite relevant here. So we kind of thought about some recommendations we could have based on the AI, but the ones you actually include, of course, are going to depend on what happens in the scenarios. So these are kind of like useful reminders. This isn't just a list for you to copy out in the exam. You have to think, are these relevant? So there's no point saying reassess policy on discounts if you weren't really told about any discounts in the year. They're not going to be as relevant. But we knew, of course, that there had been some changes, late changes made by clients, and that was causing some of the costs to go up. We were told that in the exam paper, and we were told it in the AI as well, late amendments to monthly orders from large clients. So we could think of some recommendations there. So enforce the client order deadlines. You could, add in some of these other ones as well. Introduce penalties, reduce wastage by introducing pigging. So we're told about pigging in the AI. Continue with new dog fit, because it's been doing really well, but it was still in that evaluation phase. So we tell them to continue with it, let it continue past the next gateway. So you could see how you could end up with 6 or 7 recommendations here for requirement 1, but always thinking what's most relevant based on what's happened in the year. So margins are under pressure. That's why introducing direct to consumer sales were on there. This one's usually on there. Win more retail clients, because Taylors is doing really well. It's the driver of growth in the business. So win more of these retail clients. That would be a sensible action point following on what's happened in the year. enforcing the client order deadline because that was causing overheads to increase, invest in pigging because that would help reduce this wastage. And then you always get your own recommendation as well, which helps because these are quite specific. But then you get that one, you only need 2 more to get you to a pass there. But you can see I would have picked up the clearly competent there. So you can see, overall how you can get the clearly competent in every box in requirement 1 that you need in order to get your 100%. So this would enable you to get 100% in requirement 1. So I don't think there's anything in there which is horrendously difficult. It's not as though, if I'm saying, get 100% in a BPT exam and, you've got a really technical question which comes up and you think, well, it'd be so difficult to kind of get all those marks. I don't think there's really anything in here where I'd look at that and think, no, that's so difficult. I don't think it's kind of realistic to expect people to get it. And hopefully you kind of feel the same there. It's very much about exam technique, using that exam scenario as much as possible to answer the specific requirement and only bring in the AI where it is clearly relevant. I think perhaps the hardest bits in requirement 1 are the further analysis points. But once you've practiced several case study exams and practiced several of our mock exams, you'll soon start to pick up the types of points that are quite interesting to look at. And if you are doing CR and SBM at the same time, then those performance analysis type questions, are very similar, and therefore you'll be practicing those skills when you do that there as well. And if we step back and think, okay, well, what is it we need to actually pass this? Well, if you only need to get sufficiently competent in 6 of the boxes in order to pass, you can see that there's enough easy points here. So the conclusions, revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, KPI issue, you can see that's relatively straightforward to pass. Quite often they'd require a point on it being by channel as well. But you can see most of the points in these boxes are probably slightly easier than these ones. But even still, you've kind of got 3 boxes here. The conclusions isn't too difficult, and that gets you to 4. And then these are just for the appendix numbers as well. So actually, I think passing requirement 1 isn't too difficult. I think the problem that most people have with requirement 1 and what lets them down on requirement 1 is they do too much. They spend too long on requirement 1, and where they fail is requirement 2 or 3 because they don't have enough time to get those points down. But they actually failed it on requirement 1 because they spent too long on requirement 1, and therefore they ate into their requirement 2 or 3 time, and therefore they didn't leave themselves enough time to get enough points down. At the end of the day, you can only type so quickly, you can only read so quickly, you can only think of points so quickly. If you do not leave enough time for requirement 2 and 3, you could make it impossible to pass because you can only read and type so quickly. So it's so important on requirement 1 that you stick to time. And that's why it's really important that you practice several mock exams so you can really refine your exam technique. Refine your technique, get quick, get concise like this, short, concise, really efficient writing style, so that you can get all the points you need within the time limit. And you also need to be quite ruthless with yourself as well. Even if you get to this issue, if you're running out of time, then you need to move on. Even if you know some of the other points you're going to get are going to score you marks, because if you've already done well on these other parts, then you've already done what you needed to pass requirement 1. You just need a few points here, move on, do the conclusions and finish on time. Like I said, it's better to get 8 or 7 on requirement 1 within time than getting all 11 boxes but run 20 minutes over, because you need to pass each requirement. So you need to be strict with yourself and don't try to be too much of a perfectionist. So it's really important that you appreciate this marking key and understand how the marking works so you can understand those points. So immediately after completing the main body to requirement 1, you should do the executive summary. So the executive summary is a summary of the key points from the report. So there shouldn't be anything new in the executive summary. So it's just the points which are already in the report. You're taking the key points only. So if you just completed requirement 1, it makes sense to do the executive summary for requirement 1 immediately after. Now we've already done the conclusions for requirement 1, and you might wonder, well, what's the difference between a conclusion and a summary? So of course, they're inherently similar. What we're going to want in a summary is, the main points. And we've already got these here in the conclusions. So there are different ways that you could, go about doing this. You could write the executive summary from scratch, but remember, you would just be taking, these main points. Now, the executive summary needs to summarize everything that was asked for in that requirement. So revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, KPI issue. And therefore, if you type it from scratch, you're going to need these points in there. So one option would be for you to start your executive summary to give yourself a base for your executive summary by copying the conclusions, because this has the main points. This has the key number for everything you need. Remember, we kept our conclusions really brief, and all we had in our conclusions was the main points, the main numbers. So therefore, we've got the key basic facts already in the conclusion. So how much revenue's gone up by for each channel, cost of sales, how much it went up by, a brief reason, gross profit, how much it went up by, and the margin with a key reason, and the KPI issue. So therefore, you could copy these over as a starting point only. What you certainly shouldn't do is copy over all of your requirement, because you're going to have too much detail, or have conclusions which are really lengthy and then copy those over, because there is a mark for keeping this concise. But even if you typed your exec summary from scratch, you would need to have overall revenue with the number, revenue by channel with the number. So therefore, even if you typed it from scratch, it's going to look exactly like this. So therefore, I can see the justification for saying that actually it's just quicker to copy this over as a starting point, because even if I type it from scratch, it's going to look exactly the same. So you can do this as a starting point, so you've got the main numbers already there. However, there is a skill to the executive summary, and the skill is you identifying what are the most important points to have in the exec summary. So if you've kept your conclusions nice and concise, where you've just got the main numbers, then what you're going to need to do is think back to the requirement as a whole, everything that happened in that year, and you're going to need to decide which additional points are worth bringing in to the exec summary. Because all we did in the conclusions was just take the number and a brief reason. However, in the exec summary, what we're going to want is some of these further insight points, some of these interesting points, some of these points which really kind of add value. Remember, when we typed each section, we did number, then the reason. So we had the number and we said, that was the easy bit. Then we had the reason, which we said, again, that was quite easy. But then we had these further insight points, which were difficult, but they were kind of like the interesting points. These were the bits which were a bit more interesting, because they kind of dug a bit deeper and picked out these underlying trends. So in our conclusions, all we had was a number and the reason, really brief, just a key fact, what's the number, and we've added the reason in there as well. Now, what we're going to want to do in the exec summary is to add in some of these interesting points that we identified. So let's think about the really big picture points. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to think about, if we're only going to be able to add in a few additional points, and we'll come back to why you can only add in a few additional points after, but if you can only add in a couple of additional points which are the most significant. So if you think, the executive summary is for the executives, it's for the directors. They're interested in the overall big picture position of the business because they need to make the strategic decisions, like which channel should we focus on? Should we discontinue a particular product or a particular channel? Should we change suppliers? What they're probably not interested in is really kind of, minute details, like if we had like an administration cost that had gone up by 0.5% or something like that. They're not interested in that. So we're thinking about the big picture strategic issues facing the business. So if you think here about our big picture points, what did we find out quite interesting about revenue? So if you think about overall revenue, what we did say was particularly interesting was that actually if you stripped out Taylors, revenue had continued to decline. So therefore, actually, if you strip out Taylors, then revenue was declining. So that was an interesting point, very interesting point when we looked at revenue. And that is something that the directors should be made aware of, that actually we're telling you here, overall revenue, has gone up, and that's an impressive performance, but actually that's masking the underlying trend. And actually excluding Taylors, then revenue has continued to decrease. So therefore you can see how that would be a point which is worth bringing into the executive summary. So think about it, you're kind of starting with just the raw numbers, the very basic numbers, but you've got scope to add in like 3 or 4 additional points that weren't in the conclusions, that are kind of beyond the numbers of interesting points, those further insight points. So we can think, with any of these channels, vets, pet stores, other or Taylors, was there anything worth mentioning here? So again, maybe when we said pet stores have gone up. So, you could have gone into the detail a little bit about, number of clients has gone up, but average revenue clients gone down. Again, that's probably quite getting into the minute detail. It is quite a big revenue stream, so possibly, but that probably doesn't feel like that's the biggest issue. So we said, Taylors has gone up. Perhaps we could add the point that they've got higher discount and credit terms that could have a negative impact on gross profit margin on cash. But we're probably going to add in a point on gross profit margin because this is definitely a big issue facing the business because gross profit margin is declining. So maybe we could add in a point about, how much Taylor now accounts for and the increased importance of it. So they'll now be even more aware of how much an important client this is. So perhaps that could be something that you could add in to the exec summary. So we said, Taylors has increased impressively. So we can say Taylors now accounts for this amount of revenue and what it was in the previous year. And it shows the increasing importance. So again, you can see this is like an additional point we've added in here to the exec summary. So there is a real skill to the executive summary, and don't just dismiss it as, I'm just going to copy my conclusions and I'll be done with it. You might do that as a starting point to get the main numbers in. Okay, that's fine. But what you need to do is you really need to show some skill and judgment in deciding on which additional points you're going to add in. So again, with cost of sales, was there anything interesting? That we started off in the conclusions with the bare bones conclusion on cost of sales that it's gone up. So if you think back to our cost of sales, was there a particular cost that was interesting? Maybe materials because it had the target in there, and it also increased by the most. So maybe that was the more significant one, where you could see that wastage is up again, and this is way above the target and way above what they considered exceptional. So therefore, we perhaps could have added that bit in as well. So we could have added in an additional point there. So we could have added in our point on materials. So you can kind of think as having a bit more scope to add in a little bit more detail, but you need to be very selective. What's the most important point here? So maybe adding something about materials, but again, that is quite, not necessarily niche, but quite getting into the detail, maybe a bit too much for directors, but that is something which is rising and is perhaps a concern to them. Now, definitely gross profit. This is definitely kind of a big picture issue. because we're seeing a significant change in the profit margin. So again, significant changes in a particular channel, a change in a profit margin. So the big picture issues, revenue, profit, cash, that's what I would think about there. That's what the main kind of financial concerns would be for the business: revenue, profit, cash. So are there kind of big changes or big developments in any of those? And definitely here with profit, because we saw that decline in the gross profit margin, and that is a serious concern here for the business. So we could perhaps add in an additional point here. I mean, we had most of it in the conclusion because it was so important, but we could perhaps add an additional point in here. So continued decline is concerning and unsustainable. And then I kind of said 2 to 3, so that maybe we're kind of pushing it a little bit here, but it doesn't look too long, and we'll come back to what is too long or what isn't too long after. We could possibly raise an additional point about the KPI issue, because we kind of considered, first of all, so in our conclusions, we said, what had kind of caused the issue, and actually, the fall in gross profit margin suggests that there had been excessive discounting, whereas actually, some of those were permitted, so maybe it wasn't the issue. But what is certainly should be a concern to directors is that, Hugh is threatening to take, some of the clients away from DGS, and that is definitely something that the directors need to be aware of. So you could possibly add that point in as well. Maybe he then look back at it and think, well, probably I did quite a bit in here. Is this getting a bit too long? I don't think this is. I'd probably kind of consider this as like the optimal length for the exec summary, because we also need to have 2 or 3 recommendations in there as well. Now, don't just kind of always go for like a general generic one. Try to think of the ones which are most relevant based on a scenario. So maybe introducing, we know that the main issues coming from the requirement, from the scenario, were that excluding Taylor's revenue is falling and profit margins are falling as well. So I would suggest, having a point maybe on introducing the direct to consumer sales as, one recommendation. Discounts are causing a fall in gross profit margin, so we could possibly add one of those in as well. And then maybe we said we'd have some other recommendations as well, didn't we, when we went through that list? So you could possibly add in, one of your other recommendations as well. I mean, maybe have 3 recommendations in there, but I'd probably keep it to, 3 there as a maximum from commercial recommendations. And we always need to have one of these recommendations as well. So perhaps seek legal protection here to prevent you taking one of those clients back. And if you keep your exec summary, I think to around about 2/3 of a page, that would seem, quite reasonable. And you can see by keeping the conclusions nice and concise, I've kind of left myself more room to add in some of those more interesting points. So when I've kept my points here nice and short and concise, and I've kept my conclusions nice and short and concise, because remember, to pass the conclusions, you just need to have a conclusion on each. So conclusion on revenue, conclusion on cost of sales, conclusion on gross profit, and conclusion on the KPI issue. So just a comment, with the figure. So if you've just got here that it's increased and you've got a brief reason, that would qualify as a comment, and you've got the number, and therefore you get the marks. You don't need kind of much here in the conclusion. So you want to keep those nice and brief, so they've just got the main numbers in, and then you can copy those as a starting point, because like I said, the facts are the facts. Cost of sales went up by X%. So, that has to be in the exec summary. So whether you write that from scratch or whether you copy it, it's going to look the same, anyway. So you could probably save yourself a bit of time by just copying those basic points over. But the skill is to then decide, what are the most important issues facing the business, the big picture issues? What are the directors most interested in? What do the directors need to be made aware of? Well, is there a particular revenue stream which is performing well or performing poorly? Perhaps more importantly, if it's performing poorly. But they also want to know good news as well. They want to know, what's working in the business, so they can perhaps capitalize on that. Is there a particular profit margin, which is falling on a particular channel. In this case, we had it for the whole business and that was falling. Is there anything which is really impacting cash? That's why you could have perhaps brought in that point about Taylors, because that would gradually, have an impact on the cash balance in the business. So of course, that's kind of the key things that, the directors would be looking at, but there's plenty of cash in the business. That wasn't a major concern for, the company at this year end. But they're the things we're looking at there into the exec summary. So you could think of it as like conclusions plus. So you're kind of adding a bit more here. So if we then have a look at the marking key for the exec summary, you'll see what I mean, because we've got our revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, qualitative comment with figure, and a conclusion on the KPI issue. So you can see in the exec summary, they've got the same points there, because like I said, a conclusion and a summary are inherently similar. If you're going to conclude on the performance for the year, when you've been asked to look at revenue, cost of sales, and gross profit, you need a point on revenue, cost of sales, and gross profit. If you're going to write a summary on the performance for the year, when you've been asked to look at revenue, cost of sales, and gross profit, your summary needs to include, revenue, cost of sales, and gross profit. We're accountants, you need to have a number in there as well as some analysis. So therefore, there's an inherent overlap here. And therefore, that is why, that's why you end up with the same kind of points here. And of course, the KPI issue was the other thing we were asked to comment on. So you can see, these are the same points, as the conclusions. Whereas in this box, you can see there's some additional points. So that's why you should think of the exec summary as like conclusions plus. And this is where the skill comes in, because you need to pick out the key points affecting the business, the big picture issues like we've talked about. So gross profit margin declining is a serious concern. And actually revenue's gone up, but it had declined without Taylors. And therefore the underlying business is not performing well. Now I added in a couple of other points. You can see this point was on there. Increasing dependence on Taylors wasn't on there. They didn't add anything about materials. I was a little bit on the fence about that, and you can kind of see why. But the gross profit margin, that was really important. They didn't add an extra point in here about, the clients leaving, so that wasn't on the marking key. But then we've got the recommendations. So reassess discount. So we can see that, that one was on there. Now this final one, appropriate summary of report. Because you might have thought, well, like, rather than me, trying to guess, well, not guess, but rather than me having to decide what the most important points are to bring back in, why don't I just copy over my whole requirement one, and then I've got every point in there. And then surely I'd get, this, and I'd probably get these ones as well. However, that is clearly, not in, the spirit of the exam, and that would not be appropriate to do in a report. And therefore that would almost be trying to exploit this kind of marking key in a way, and that would certainly not be appropriate or professional to do that. So that's something you certainly shouldn't do. And actually this mark kind of acts as a bit of a protection against that, because if you do that, then it wouldn't be an appropriate summary. It would be far too long. It wouldn't be a summary. It would just instead be the exact core of the information repeated again, rather than summarizing it. So therefore you would lose this point. And you can see there's only 4 points in this box. So if you lost that one, you'd need all of these 3 to get this point and pass, to get sufficiently competent and pass. So you can see that actually by penalizing students who kind of copy too much of their report and making it too long, you can then see that it puts them in a very borderline position where they'd need to have all of these points. And actually, it could be the case that you hadn't picked this up in the main body of the analysis. And therefore, if you kind of missed out one of these points, then you would fail this box. So therefore, this is actually a very valuable point to get, because it's giving you 1 out of the 3 points you need to pass. And therefore, as long as your exec summary isn't too long, and therefore, this would be considered an appropriate length, providing it isn't too long, you get this point. And therefore, you'd only need 2 out of these 3 in order to pass. So you absolutely need to make sure that your exec summary doesn't get too long. So if you are going to take the approach of copying your conclusions, which is fine to do, which is acceptable to do, as a starting point, then you just need to make sure the additional points you add in don't take you kind of too far over. And therefore, it's really important that you keep your conclusions concise, because if your conclusions are too long, then your exec summary is going to start off really long. And then when you add in some extra points, it's going to become too long. So you need to really develop the skill, firstly, of keeping your conclusions nice and concise, and then deciding which points are the most important to add on. So those big picture points, looking at revenue, profit, and cash, focusing on areas which are, declining or areas of risk, but also looking at ones which are performing particularly well and could be areas of focus going forward. So quite a skill there with the executive summary. And as always, best way to practice it is with lots and lots of exam questions, lots of practice, so you can master this skill. So if we step back and look at requirement 1 overall, you can see in the main body of your report, you'd have your sections based on the requirement wording. So revenue, cost of sales, and gross profit. Mini paragraphs in your revenue section, taking it each channel at a time, number, reason, further insight, point, and context, revenue mix, and overall revenue. So by channel, overall revenue, and revenue mix. Then cost of sales, we could take it by cost of sales line, similar to revenue, number, reason, further insight, point, context. Gross profit, focusing on that margin, looking at the reasons why the profit margin has changed. And then we've got the one-off unpredictable piece of analysis. Want to do this within the time. So again, as always, short, concise range of points. We'll need a few recommendations to go with that. You could include them here, or you could include them up with the other recommendations, or up here with the issue itself. And then with our conclusions, we want to keep these nice and brief, but still thorough. So we need to conclude on everything we've been asked for. So overall revenue, and by channel, cost of sales, gross profit, and the KPI issue. So keeping it nice and brief. We've then been working on our appendices in the spreadsheets. We can copy that over, make sure that we give it a proper title. So analysis of the management accounts for the period. Make sure you've got headings here. It's clear that everything is in thousands. So you can copy your appendices, your appendix 1 over. So you've got that there. Nice and clear for the examiners to mark. We can pick up those marks. And then we can see here that we would have our executive summary. Now the unhighlighted text is the conclusions. We'd have copied those over as a starting point, and then we'd add in those additional points we said. So you can see that, it's the same as the conclusions, but then we have added in those additional points. So think of it as like conclusions plus. And then we've got our recommendations there as well. So that's our overall summary of our approach for requirement 1. So hopefully you're very clear on that. So my top tips for requirement 1, and I'm sure that our other prize winners would agree with this, but it's really important that you read the requirement very carefully and then use that for your report headings. So as you see me do there with revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, and the KPI issue, throughout I made sure that I fully focused on those being the issue. And even if when analysing the AI, I thought, operating profit would be examined, or maybe cash, I have not forced those into my answer, because that's not what the requirement asked for. So prior to the exam, make sure you practice appendix 1 several times to improve your speed. So this is a big benefit of our mock exams because they enable you to practice various requirement ones so you can practice your speed in the spreadsheet software. So you can practice getting your prior year numbers in quickly, calculating those current year numbers quickly, saving you time in the exam and improving your accuracy. So think about how you're going to plan your requirement one mini paragraphs. So as I kind of said, you could do it like this, although the way I prefer to do it was using our report pro forma. And as I demonstrated earlier, you can kind of put the points on, as we read through the exam paper information, start to think about where you're going to put the points, what your further insight points will be, and what your context points will be. So make sure you use the exam paper information as much as you can. And you saw me doing that, and I've emphasized that enough. I really can't say it enough. Use that exam paper information as much as possible. Remember that additional piece of analysis isn't essential to pass, as I said, and as I demonstrated, I'd already passed requirement one before I did that, before I got onto that KPI issue. Provided I've avoided, not attempted, even if I just got 1 or 2 points in those, I still would have passed the exam. So, don't get too sucked into it and make sure you finish requirement one on time. Be really thorough with the numbers in the conclusion, and therefore you'll be thorough with them in the exec summary. Don't slack on the numbers. Sometimes I see students doing this, they almost get a bit tired of typing out the numbers, every time doing the percentage change and the increase. But don't start skipping out numbers, because if you look at the marking key, you need to have the numbers on there as you would in a real report. If you're preparing a report analysing the performance, you're going to need to have, the numbers in there. So I wouldn't scrimp on those. Be short and concise. You'll see, the way I type points, I'm short and concise. There's not a lot of, kind of waffle in there. I'm not kind of going on about the point. I don't make the same point several times over. I'm short and concise. I make the point and move on. So, revenue vectors increases disappointingly. Here's the reason, here's the context, and I move on to the next one. So short and concise is the way to be. So you can get the mark in as few words as possible. So I'm getting the mark in as little time as possible. That's the aim of the game here. It's a time-pressured exam. We want to get as many marks as possible. Therefore, you want to get each mark in as little time as possible. And therefore, writing concisely will enable you to do that. So you have my model answers, and therefore you can see exactly how I do that. You don't need to spend an excessive amount of time planning. Now, you've got your pro forma report. You kind of already thought about how you're going to lay requirement one out. You have your pro forma report for your case study business. You'd have thought about how requirement one is going to be laid out, how it's going to be structured. And therefore you've got a plan here. Yeah, albeit it's quite a loose plan, and you're going to adapt it based on what comes up in the exam scenario, but you have your plan here. So yes, as we read through the exam paper information, we need to think, what's going where, which points we're going to include. But you kind of almost got a draft plan and you're just kind of tweaking it. But for the other parts here, so like the additional analysis or conclusions, you don't need to plan them out. You know what they kind of roughly need to look like. And having practiced our mock exams, you've got really good at that and you'll be really familiar with that. So therefore you don't need to keep planning everything out before you write it. At the end of the day, you've got a limited amount of time in the exam. And therefore, again, you want to be as quick as possible. You want to be short, concise, fast in the exam. So if you can kind of already have in your head what you're going to have for each section, then that'll kind of help you reduce your planning time. And the reduction in your planning time is going to increase the amount of time you have typing your report, typing mark scoring points. The reason my students and I have been so successful at the ACA case study exam is because we have worked relentlessly on our exam technique. So if you want to achieve similar levels of success, you now need to do the same. So you need to go away and practice several requirement ones, one after the other. So if you spent the time reading the DGS AI, you will now be able to get 4 exam attempts out of that one set of advanced information. There is, of course, the ICAEW exam available on the ICAEW website, the actual exam in November 21 for DGS. However, if you also go to our website, the ACA Masters website, and go to the case study page, now if you scroll to the bottom, so if you go past the recent student feedback, details of our live tuition, video tuition, and our materials for the upcoming case study exam, then at the bottom of the page, what you'll find is our free download section, where you'll be able to download the AI analysis, pro forma report, and mock exams, marking grids, and model answers for some of the earlier case study exams. Now, these are a very valuable resource because if you spent time and you've invested that time reading the advanced information, of course, usually you would only be able to get one exam out of it. You'd only usually be able to attempt the ICAEW exam, the actual exam for that advanced information. However, if you download our resources, then you'll be able to have 3 mock exams. So there's mock exam 1, and there's also mock exam 2 and mock exam 3. So that means you've got 3 completely different requirement 1s. So you can now go and attempt 3 different requirement 1s so that you can work on your exam technique, so that you can practice reading and interpreting the requirement, so focusing on exactly what it is asking you for, including the numbers in your Appendix 1 and calculating the year-on-year movements, so copying the numbers from here into the spreadsheet area and then using the AI analysis document so that you can put in the prior year numbers, so therefore you can get quicker at your Appendix 1, so you can practice that. You can practice interpreting the exam information and deciding which piece of information you're going to use for each section of your report. Is this a reason revenue went up? Is this a reason profit went down? How should I use this additional information here that we're provided in the exam? So you can practice that skill there. And then using the pro forma report to guide you, you can then structure each section of your report so that you can type it up in full and get to your final answer. So you can produce your Appendix 1 and then use a pro forma report to guide you so that you can type your report in full. And you can work on your exam technique of getting quicker with your typing, getting quicker at using that exam paper information and identifying where you're going to use it in the exam, practice getting your context points in, and you'll get to see several of the one-off piece of analysis issues as well. So you can now go away, perhaps start with mock exam 1 because you've already seen that, or maybe you'd want to go straight on to mock exam 2. So you can go and practice a requirement 1. You don't need to sit there for the full 4 hours. You're just doing requirement 1. So you can just focus on requirement 1 for now. So you can attempt that requirement 1. And then importantly, once you have done that, you then need to go and mark your answer. Now, this is a very important part of your exam preparation because this will get you interacting with the marking key and it will develop your understanding of how case study is marked. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. So once you have completed your answer, you then need to mark it. So you could see here, for example, revenue from vets has increased moderately by this. So then you can go to the marking key. Yes, got the number here for vets. I've got that mark. So that's the mark for the number. Have we got the reason? Due to the recruitment of smaller independent vet practices. So yes, we've got that reason there. Then we can jump on, is our further insight point right? So looking at the number of clients, looking at the revenue per client. So you can see, perhaps that one, wasn't on there this time. So perhaps, slightly frustrating. And then we've got a context point about price-based competition, increasing concentration of clients. And therefore we can see we pick that mark up there. So it's actually very easy to mark the case study exam. It's an objective marking key. If you've got the point, you'll get the mark. It doesn't have to be exactly word for word, but if you have made that point in slightly different words, you will still get the mark. So you could kind of go through all of them. So, overall revenue, you've got the number, strong performance compared to the market. So therefore, we've got overall revenue. Then we can see, is there anything, comparison to industry growth? Then we can look at, some of the other points here. All channels have seen an increase, excluding food retailers. It's gone up by this. It's below the target. So again, you can just kind of go through and see which points you've got. Frustratingly, we've got like a backslash there. Compared it to, the prior year growth. So the rate of growth is increasing. So we can see we've picked up that mark there. So again, you can go through, you can mark your answer, and then you can kind of step back and see, well, did I get 3 points in a box? If so, I passed the box, I got an SC. If you got 4, fantastic, you got the highest mark that you can get. And of course, if you've got 5 or 6, you get the same. So then overall, you can step back and you can see, did I get at least 6 sufficiently competent across the whole requirement? And if so, then that would indicate that you would pass the exam. However, we need to make sure that you wouldn't get too many, not attempted as well. But you shouldn't even be borderline. If you use this technique, if you use a technique I've shown you, you're going to be getting mainly SCs and CCs, just as I did, just as my students have. So therefore, you can kind of step back and maybe you'll get, CCs and SCs in most of them, but, maybe for some reason you got like an ID here, and therefore you can think, okay, well, what goes in this box? And by, marking your answer and seeing where your weakness points are, you can then kind of look into this box and think, okay, well, what types of points are in there? And then you can kind of go back to the earlier part of the class when I explained, oh, these are the evaluation points. So these are the points where we're getting those further insight points. So here, for example, number, reason, and then some of those further insight points here, like comparing it to that industry benchmark. So you can see here, so that was that type of point, and that's perhaps what you didn't do in your answer. Maybe you just did number and reason, and therefore you didn't get any of these further insight points, and that's why you didn't get those points. So by attempting the exam and then marking it, you'll start to identify your specific weakness areas, because you'll see when you mark it, which boxes did you fail on, which boxes did you not pass. And you'll familiarize yourself with the marking key and the frustrations in it, where you can make a good point and it's not on there, and that's kind of tough luck, you don't get the mark. But it's good for you to kind of experience that, and you'll really kind of understand the marking key and you'll really interact with it. And by doing this, you'll build up a comprehensive understanding of the case study exam, how it's marked, and therefore kind of working backwards, how you should be attempting it. And therefore you can see by following this approach, it will ensure that you do everything that you're required to do in the exam and put you on course for potentially scoring 100% in the final ACA exam. So really important, after you attempt it, you go away and mark it. Now, if you're unsure as to how you should be typing these points, or the types of points that should be included, or where you should be including them, of course, you have my model answers. So you can go back to these as well and look at how you should be typing points. And even if, you do really well, but you overrun on time, then you can kind of go back and look at the model answer and see how you could have made that point more concisely. So again, using these resources, you can really work on your exam technique. And even though this won't be the case study business in your actual exam, what you're doing here is something that's very, very important, and you're optimizing your exam technique. As I said at the start of the class, every case study business is different. It's based on a different business, but the fundamentals of the exam are the same. The requirements are the same. The things you have to do in each requirement are broadly the same. The advanced information is broadly in the same format, and the marking key as well is in the same format. So even though your advanced information for your case study business isn't out now, you can still be doing work because you can be working on your exam technique. And that is a fundamental part of case study exam success. It is more important to get your exam technique spot on than it is to be an absolute expert in the advanced information. Too many students are the other way around. They focus too much on the advanced information. They think it's all about being really strong on the advanced information and knowing it inside out and having lots of additional research points. That's not what it's about here. It's very much about exam technique, as it is with all the ACA exams. It's an exam at the end of the day. Exam technique is everything. So it's an exam, it's about scoring marks, which comes down to exam technique, scoring marks as quickly as possible. And the way you do that is by using this technique, and the way that you kind of learn this technique inside out, like I have, like my students have, is by practicing. So even though this isn't your case study business, practicing your exam technique is the most important thing with case study, and therefore it's almost irrelevant that this isn't your case study business, because you're working on that exam technique, understanding the marking key, understanding how marks are awarded, and perfecting your technique so that you score as many marks as possible in your exam. So please go away now and practice several requirement ones, one after the other. So you've got the 3 mock exams, and the ICAEW exam is available to ACA students on the ICAEW website. So you can practice 4 requirement ones. And you'll also be able to see how well our materials would have had you prepared for your actual exam. So another additional benefit there, another source of reassurance, but really important, you go away, practice that exam technique, and begin to master this prize-winning technique for the case study exam. So I look forward to helping you with requirements 2 and 3 in the later classes before we move on to look at the live advanced information.